Hey you! Yeah, you the one who's quietly lying there right now, probably with the phone screen dimmed all the way down, maybe with a pillow tucked just the right way. Welcome back. Or if this is your very first night here, welcome. You found a good place to be. Okay. Before we dive in tonight, I want to ask you something strange. Close your eyes for just a second and imagine this. No streetlights, no phone glow, no little standby light on your television, no distant hum of the city bleeding through the curtains. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. A darkness so complete, so thick and heavy that you cannot see your own hand right in front of your face. Now imagine that is every single night of your life. No exceptions. No electricity waiting around the corner. No flashlight in the drawer. Just the dark. The real dark. The kind of dark that our ancestors knew in their bones, that lived in their nightmares, shaped their prayers, and quietly rewrote the rules of human life every single evening when the sun went down. Here is the thing that is going to keep you awake tonight in the best possible way. The people of medieval Europe did not simply go to bed when darkness fell. They had an entire secret world that came alive after sunset. A world with its own rules, its own rhythms, its own dangers, and honestly its own kind of strange and beautiful intimacy. And most of us have absolutely no idea it ever existed. Tonight we're going to step through that darkness together. If you are enjoying what we explore here on this channel, it would genuinely mean a lot to me if you took just a tiny moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Not because an algorithm told me to ask, but because the more of you who come along on these journeys, the richer and deeper these stories get to be. And hey, drop a comment down below. Tell me where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is there. There is something oddly wonderful about knowing that somewhere right now, someone in a different time zone is reading the same ancient darkness I am describing. Now let us keep the room soft and still. If you have a fan, turn it on low. Let the sound carry the story, and let us begin. Let us go back, way back. Picture a Thursday evening in the year 1100 and something, say 1142, because history deserves a specific year, not just a vague wave of the hand. You're in a town somewhere in the English countryside, not London. London is its own chaotic creature even then. No, you're in a smaller place. Maybe a market town with a church, a mill, a handful of streets, and a few hundred people who all more or less know each other's business, which is both a comfort and an absolute nightmare. The day has been long, really long. Medieval peasants and craftspeople began work before sunrise, before the sun was even fully up, before most of us today would consider it a reasonable hour to exist as a conscious human being. They ploughed, they hammered, they kneaded bread dough in the dark, they hauled water. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, and the shadows started stretching long across the cobblestones, these people had already put in more hours of physical labour than most of us do in 2 modern workdays. And then the sun moved lower, and then it was simply gone. What happened next is something most of us have never experienced and can barely imagine. The darkness that fell over a medieval town or village was not the darkness we know today. Historians and researchers who have studied pre-industrial nightlife, particularly the scholar Roger Ekirch, whose landmark book on the history of nighttime changed how we understand our own ancestors, describe what they called the old night, the real night, the ancient night. On a cloudy evening with no moon, a medieval street was not dim. It was not murky. It was not gloomy. It was black. Completely, totally, breathtakingly black. Ekirch describes accounts of people falling into ditches they knew were there, drowning in ponds they had walked past 1,000 times in daylight, losing themselves on paths they had travelled their entire lives simply because there was nothing, not a single photon of light to guide them. People painted their doorknobs white. Think about that for a moment. They painted their doorknobs white just so they could find their own front doors in the dark. They stripped the bark off trees along familiar paths to make them glow faintly in what little moonlight might exist. They marked piles of light-coloured soil at the corners of the roads. These were not superstitions or decorations. These were survival strategies. This was the world after sunset. Now here is where it gets philosophically interesting, and I think this part will genuinely stay with you. For most of human history, darkness was not simply the absence of light. That is the modern scientific understanding. But medieval people and the scholars who wrote about them, and the theologians who thought deeply about the world, experienced darkness as a thing, an actual substance, something that arrived, something that had weight and intention and some believed spiritual meaning. St. Augustine, writing centuries before the medieval period but deeply influential across all of it, taught that light was a symbol of divine goodness and truth. Darkness, by extension, was not merely neutral. It was the absence of God's presence. It was where evil was most comfortable. It was where things could happen that daylight would never permit. And this was not just theology for monks and bishops. This lived in the gut of every farmer, every baker, every mother tucking children in at night. The darkness was not safe. The darkness was not quiet. The darkness was active. Creaky floorboards at midnight were not just old wood contracting in the cold. That was something. A muttering voice drifting from the street outside was not a neighbour talking in their sleep. That was someone or something, and nothing good happened in the streets after dark. Everybody knew this. The darkness had teeth, and the medieval world built an entire social and legal architecture around that fear. Here is a fact that might genuinely surprise you. The word curfew. You have heard it your whole life. Your parents enforced it. Cities still impose them during emergencies. You have used it yourself without a second thought. But do you know what it actually means? It comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, cover fire, not go to bed, not stay inside, cover fire. The original curfew was a literal instruction backed by law and enforced by actual punishment, that when the evening bell rang, usually around 8 o'clock in the evening, sometimes 9, every household in the town was required to either extinguish their fire completely or cover it with a metal dome banking the coals under ash to prevent stray sparks. Why? Because medieval towns were made almost entirely of wood. The houses were wood, the market stalls were wood, the churches, the grandest buildings in most communities were often wood or wood and thatch in their early forms. And fire did not stay politely in one place. Fire moved, fire travelled, fire consumed entire neighbourhoods in a single night. The Great Fire of London in 1666, centuries after the medieval period, still managed to destroy over 13,000 houses and 87 churches in the supposedly more sophisticated era of early modern England. In the medieval period, fire was existential. One uncovered candle, one ember rolling from an unbanked hearth onto a rush mat on the floor that could end your town. So when the bell rang, you covered your fire, not as a suggestion, as a law. William the Conqueror, the Norman king who seized England in 1066 and remade it entirely in his own image, made this curfew policy into a sweeping kingdom-wide regulation. Part fire safety, yes. But also historians note part political control. Secret meetings happened at night. Resistance movements gathered in the dark. Rebellions were planned by firelight in hushed voices. By legally extinguishing those fires, William was not just protecting wooden buildings. He was quite literally putting out the flames of organised resistance. Darkness was power, and controlling what happened in it, who moved through it, who was allowed to be in it, who had the right to carry a light that was one of the most important tools of medieval authority. So let us talk about what the night actually looked like in a medieval town, because I think the physical reality of it is something worth sitting with for a moment. You are inside. The curfew bell has rung. Your fire, if you could afford one and not everyone could, is banked or covered. Maybe there is one small oil lamp, or a rushlight burning if you are lucky, or if your household can spare the tallow and the rush. But these were not the bright, cheerful candles of modern imagination. A rushlight was a dried reed dipped in animal fat. It gave roughly as much light as a single birthday candle, maybe less, and it smelled like burning fat, which honestly is probably fine if you've never known anything else, but is not exactly the cozy ambience we picture when we imagine a medieval cottage. Outside your walls the town was completely dark. Not mostly dark, not lit here and there by the warm glow of windows. The shutters were closed partly against the cold, partly against the very darkness itself, which remember people experienced as a physical presence. The streets were empty, or if they were not empty, then the people in them were exactly the kind of people the authorities had always warned you about. Nightwalkers, thieves, people who moved in darkness because daylight would condemn them. Medieval English law, particularly the Statute of Winchester in 1285, which is one of the earliest comprehensive legal documents about nighttime behaviour in England, described what historians now call the Nightwalker Statutes. If you were found on the street after curfew without a very good reason, and more importantly without a lantern in your hand, you were automatically suspect. Not potentially suspect. Automatically. Presumed to be up to something. The lantern rule is fascinating. You might think that a lantern would help thieves and troublemakers see what they were doing, but the medieval logic ran the other way entirely. Honest people carried lights because they had nothing to hide. Criminals moved in darkness because they needed it. So the presence of a light actually signalled innocence, and the absence of one signalled guilt. The darkness itself was the evidence. Now I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is where this story gets genuinely beautiful underneath all the fear. The medieval night was terrifying, but it was also profoundly human. Because here is the thing about darkness, real darkness, the kind these people lived in every single night of their lives. It closes the world down. It shrinks your world to the walls of the room you're in, to the warmth of the body next to you, to the sound of breathing in the dark. And in that shrinking, something unexpected happens. People talked. Not the performing, distracted, half-present talking we do with phones in our hands and one eye on a screen. They talk the way people talk when there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. Around a dying fire, in the dark. Voices low because the night demands quiet. Children already asleep in the same room or the same bed because yes, everyone shared beds, which we will get to in a later part of tonight's story. And it is wonderfully strange. The medieval night was in its way the most intimate time of human history. And it had rules, it had a rhythm, it had textures and sounds and rituals that entire generations were born into, lived inside and died having never questioned, because they were simply the way the world worked when the sun went down. That rhythm is what we're going to explore together tonight. 12 parts. 12 windows into a world that existed for over 1,000 years and vanished so quickly, so completely, that most people alive today have never even heard a whisper of it. We're going to follow the sound of the curfew bell into the streets and meet the people whose job it was to guard the darkness. We're going to discover a lost sleep pattern that scientists now believe was humanity's natural state for all of recorded history until the Industrial Revolution quietly erased it. We're going to step inside medieval bedrooms, into candlelit chapels at 2 o'clock in the morning, into taverns that stayed quietly illegally open after curfew, into homes where families murmured prayers against demons they genuinely believed were sitting on their chests while they slept. And somewhere in all of that, I promise you, we are going to find something that feels somehow surprisingly familiar, because the dark has always been ours. We just forgot how to live in it. So, the curfew bell has rung, the fires are covered, The streets are empty, or almost empty, because somewhere out there in that absolute blackness, carrying a lantern and a long wooden staff, a man is walking. He is the night watch, and he is not exactly what you would expect. Let us go find him. So that man with the lantern, the one we left walking alone in the dark at the end of our last chapter, let us go find him. But I want to warn you before we do, he is not what you expect. Close your eyes for just a moment and picture him the way you might imagine him from a movie poster or a novel cover. Tall, broad-shouldered, serious-faced. A man of experience and quiet authority, cape-billowing lantern. Raised, scanning the shadows with the sharp eyes of someone who has seen real danger and learned to read the night like a map. Now open your eyes, because that man did not exist. What you actually had roaming the pitch-black streets of a medieval English town, the sole line of defence between the sleeping population and whatever the night might bring, was often just a regular man. A baker, a craftsman, a shoemaker, someone who had spent all day doing his actual job and was now, because his name had come up in the rotation this week, required by law to leave his warm bed, pick up a wooden staff and a lantern, and walk the streets until sunrise. No training, no uniform beyond the lantern in his hand, no salary, at least not in the early medieval period, just a civic obligation, the medieval equivalent of jury duty, except, instead of sitting in a comfortable room for a few hours, you were stumbling around in absolute darkness for an entire night in the cold, looking for trouble you very much hoped not to find. This was the night watch. And honestly, the more you learn about it, the more remarkable it is that it worked at all. Let me give you the legal backbone of this, because the history here is genuinely fascinating. The system that formalized nighttime order in medieval England and eventually spread in various forms to the American colonies and beyond was built on a document called the Statute of Winchester, passed in 1285 under King Edward I. This was not a suggestion. This was law, and its instructions were remarkably specific. In every city, 6 men were required to keep watch at every gate. In every borough, 12 men. In smaller towns, 6 or 4, depending on the size of the population. They were to keep watch, the statute said, from sunset to sunrise. No exceptions. No nights off because of weather or illness or personal inconvenience. Sunset to sunrise every night from the Feast of Ascension until the feast day of St. Michael, which ran through the entire summer and into the autumn, covering the longest and most active months of the year when travel and crime both increased. And if a stranger passed through their watch zone, they were to arrest that person and hold them until morning, when the constable could examine them properly in daylight. Think about what that phrase means in practice. A stranger passing through at night. Not someone caught in the act of a crime, just a stranger, moving in darkness. That alone was grounds for detention. The medieval night was a world in which simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply being someone that nobody recognized walking through a street after dark, made you a suspect. The burden of proof ran entirely the other direction from what we know today. You were not innocent until proven guilty after curfew. After curfew, you were guilty until daylight explained you. But here is where the story gets wonderfully humanly complicated, because the people enforcing these rules were well people. Ordinary people who had not asked for this job, who did not particularly want it, and who found countless creative ways to avoid doing it properly. The historical records from medieval and early modern England are full of these stories, and they are almost impossible not to love a little. Watchmen who were found asleep at their posts, bundled up in their cloaks in a doorway. Watchmen who slipped into an alehouse, yes, after the curfew that was supposed to close the alehouses, and stayed there drinking until the first pale light of dawn. We actually know about one specific case in 1617 in London, where a group of watchmen crept into what records describe as a victualler's house, and stayed and I am quoting directly from the historical record here, drinking and taking tobacco all night long. Not exactly the dedicated guardians of public order one might hope for. And then there was the corruption. This, I think, is one of the most fascinating dimensions of medieval nighttime law enforcement, not because corruption is admirable, but because it reveals something very true about human nature when power and darkness meet. A watchman named Edward Gardner was brought before the recorder, a kind of city judge, in 1641. His crime: he had apprehended a woman found on the streets after curfew, a woman described in the records as a common night walker, and instead of escorting her to where she was supposed to go, he had accepted 2 shillings to let her walk free. 2 shillings. The price of looking the other way in 17th century London was roughly equivalent to a couple of days' wages for a labouring man. Not a fortune, not even a particularly interesting bribe, but enough. What makes this story quietly remarkable is not that it happened. Corruption in positions of minor authority is hardly a surprise across any century, but that it was recorded, investigated, and brought before a court. There were people who cared. There were standards, even if those standards were frequently ignored. The medieval world had a legal system that was by our measures crude and often brutal, but it also had a genuine and persistent attempt to hold even its smallest officials accountable, at least some of the time. Now here is something I find genuinely thought-provoking, and I want to pause on it for a moment because I think it connects to something much larger than medieval policing. Ask yourself, what does it mean when a society's only defense against nighttime danger is an exhausted, unpaid, untrained shoemaker with a stick? It means that for most of human history, the preservation of nighttime order was not a professional enterprise. It was a communal one. It rested on the understanding that everyone shared in the responsibility for protecting the darkness, not because they were paid to, not because a government required it, but because the alternative was a night that belonged entirely to whoever was most willing to do harm in it. This is something we have almost entirely lost today. Most of us live in cities and towns where nighttime safety is entirely delegated to professionals we never see, and whose names we never know. We lock our doors and assume that somewhere out there someone paid and trained and equipped is handling whatever the night might bring. And for the most part, that system works. But there is something quietly different about a community in which every able-bodied man knows that his turn will come, that 3 nights from now or 5 it will be his name on the roster, his lantern in the dark, his responsibility to walk the streets that his neighbours and their children are sleeping beside. There is a weight to that obligation, a skin-level connection to the safety of the place you live. The medieval night watch was clumsy, it was underfunded, it was frequently drunk and occasionally corrupt. But it was also in a way that I find genuinely moving, deeply personal. Let me tell you something specific, because I think specific details are where history actually lives. The watchmen did not simply patrol silently, they called the hours. This is one of the details that tends to get lost in the popular image of the medieval night, and it is worth sitting with. Every hour through the night, the watchman was expected to call out the time and the state of the weather, loudly enough to be heard through shuttered windows, through thick stone walls, through the sleep of entire households. 9 o'clock and all is well, or in darker times, 9 o'clock and the night is cold. In some towns they carried a clapper, a wooden instrument that made a sharp rattling sound, which they could also use to signal other watchmen if they needed help. In others they called out in verse little memorized rhymes that announced the hour and the season, and the temperature drifting through empty streets in the dark. Imagine lying in bed in 1100 and something tucked in with your family in the complete silence of a medieval night, and then hearing that voice drifting through the dark outside your window. That one human voice carrying through the cold saying someone is out there, someone is watching, you can sleep. That is what the night watch actually was, I think. Not a police force, Not a law enforcement body in any modern sense, something much older and much more intimate than that. It was a promise made in the dark by ordinary people to other ordinary people. Someone is awake so that you can rest. And yet, and this is the part that always catches me, the watch was also deeply unequal. Because in medieval England, as in almost every society that has ever existed, the rules of the night were not applied evenly. If you were a nobleman or a merchant of sufficient standing, being found on the street after curfew without a lantern was embarrassing but survivable. You explained yourself. You were accompanied home, not arrested. Lord Fielding, an actual historical figure whose encounter with the watch in 1641 is documented in the records, was stopped by the watch at 1 o'clock in the morning in London. His response was to become extremely indignant, to insist that it was a disgrace to stop someone of his standing, and to threaten to physically strike the constable if his carriage was not allowed to pass immediately. The constable's response, which I find genuinely admirable, was to say that it was impossible to tell a lord from any other man by the outside of a coach, especially at unreasonable hours of the night. He did not back down. He held his ground with the full weight of the law behind him, and probably a considerable amount of personal courage against a man who outranked him socially in every measurable way. I do not know what happened next. The records do not tell us, but I like to think the constable made him wait. I like to think just for a moment that in the darkness of a medieval street, at 1 in the morning, the law was actually equal. Sometimes the night makes people honest, but there is one more dimension of this story that I do not want to skip over, because it changes the entire texture of what the night watch meant. These watchmen were not just looking for criminals, they were also watching for fire. We talked in the last section about how the medieval curfew originated in the literal covering of household fires. But the night watch added a second layer to that protection, trained or at least instructed human observers whose job included scanning the skyline for the first glow of smoke or flame, the first orange smear against the dark that meant a fire had started somewhere in the dense wooden streets of a medieval town. And fire was not a small fear. Fire was a catastrophic communal civilization-ending fear. The historical records from medieval English towns read like a litany of disasters when you start looking. London alone suffered major devastating fires in 1076, in 1135, in 1166, a century before the Great Fire of 1666 that most people know from their school history books. In each of these cases, hundreds of wooden structures burned. In some cases, entire neighbourhoods were reduced to ash in a single night. In 1212, a fire that started south of the Thames spread and destroyed the original London Bridge. The watchman then was not just a figure of law enforcement. He was the community's early warning system for the single greatest threat to its physical existence. His lantern and his voice were the difference in many cases between a controlled fire and a consumed town. This is why, despite all the complaints, despite the documented drinking and sleeping and corruption, the watch endured for centuries. Not because it was good. It frequently was not. But because the alternative, a night in which no one was watching, no voice was calling the hours, no lantern was moving through the dark, was simply unthinkable. There is something almost philosophical in that if you think about it long enough. The medieval night watch was imperfect. It was human. It was ordinary people doing an extraordinary job badly because it needed to be done and because there was no one else. And I think there is a kind of dignity in that. A quiet, unglamorous, historically forgotten kind of dignity that deserves better than the ridicule it mostly received. The man who walked those streets, tired, cold, wishing he was in his own bed, perhaps not entirely sober, was nonetheless walking. He was nonetheless out there in the dark, calling the hours so that you could sleep, which brings us actually to the sleeping. Because here is the thing about the medieval night that nobody tells you, the piece of this story that I think will genuinely surprise you, regardless of how much history you have read. The people who were safely inside, tucked away behind those shuttered windows, grateful for the watchman's voice drifting through the dark, they were not sleeping the way you and I sleep, not even close. They had a completely different relationship with the night, a different rhythm, a different biology of rest that we have entirely lost, not just forgotten, but actively erased by the Industrial Revolution in a span of just a few decades. And once I tell you about it, you will never hear yourself wake up at 2 a.m. in quite the same way again. There is a particular kind of moment, and I think most of us have had it, where you wake up in the middle of the night completely alert. Not groggy, not confused, just awake, clear-headed in a way that almost never happens at 2 p.m. You lie there in the dark and your mind is moving sharp and quiet at the same time, and some part of you wonders what is wrong with me. Why can I not just sleep through the night like a normal person? Here is what I want to tell you. Nothing is wrong with you. In fact, what you are experiencing in those strange still hours around midnight may be one of the most ancient and deeply human things your body still knows how to do. You are not broken. You are in a very specific biological sense medieval. For most of recorded history, and I mean that almost literally from the earliest written records of ancient Greece all the way through the 17th century, the idea that a person should sleep in one long unbroken 8-hour block was simply not how human beings understood sleep. It was not the goal. It was not the standard. It was not even particularly desirable. Sleep had a completely different architecture than the one we take for granted today, and understanding that architecture changes something fundamental about how you think about your own nights. The historian Roger E. Kirch spent 16 years researching what happened when the sun went down in pre-industrial Europe. He expected to write a perfectly unremarkable chapter on sleep, a biological universal he assumed unchanged across the centuries. He was by his own description dreading that chapter. He figured there would be nothing interesting to say, and then in the early 1990s he sat down in the Public Record Office in London, a great Gothic archive building filled with rows upon rows of ancient manuscripts, and began reading through court depositions from the late 17th century. And he found a 9-year-old girl named Jane Roth. Jane's testimony was part of a legal deposition from a travelling court in 1697. She was describing very matter-of-factly something that had happened one night at her home. Her mother, she said, had awoken after her first sleep and gone out. Her mother was later found dead. The phrase that caught E. Kirch's attention was not the death. It was those two words, first sleep, spoken by a 9-year-old child with the casual ease of someone describing something completely ordinary. Not first sleep as a metaphor, not first sleep as a curious poetic expression, first sleep as a recognized uncontroversial division of the night, as normal and unremarkable to Jane Roth as saying, "this morning," or "after lunch." Kirch used those words as a search term and began pulling on the thread. What he found over the following years fundamentally rewrote our understanding of how human beings have historically related to the night. Over 500 references in his initial research, more than 2,000 in a dozen languages by the time he was done. First sleep, second sleep, premier somme in French records, primo sonno in Italian. The same pattern showing up in medical texts, in personal diaries, in ballads and poems and legal documents and sermons and court records across centuries, across countries, across social classes. A pattern so commonplace, so utterly taken for granted that it rarely warranted explanation. People simply mentioned it the way you might mention breakfast. So what exactly was this pattern? Imagine a medieval household on an ordinary night. Supper has been eaten, and supper in the medieval world was a light meal, because the main meal of the day was midday dinner, not the evening feast we might picture. The fire is banked or covered, the shutters are drawn, and the household settles in for the night, often not long after sunset. In the deep midwinter, this might mean going to bed as early as 6 or 7 in the evening, which sounds absurd until you remember that in December. In England, it gets fully dark before 4 in the afternoon. The darkness is simply that long. They sleep, deeply soundly, for roughly 3 to 4 hours, and then somewhere around midnight, not because anything woke them, but because their bodies simply completed a natural sleep cycle, they come awake. Not groggy, not disturbed, alert in that strange particular way that the midnight hours have when the world is absolutely quiet, and the mind is loose and clear, and somehow more itself than it ever is in daylight. This period of wakefulness was called the watch, and it lasted typically somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. What happened during those hours is to me one of the most intimate and quietly beautiful chapters of medieval daily life that I have ever come across. Let me be honest with you about something before I go further. When I first encountered Kirch's research, my instinct was to romanticize it immediately, to picture the watch as this peaceful candlelit meditative hour of pure human tranquility, everyone lying serenely in the dark having profound thoughts. The reality, as always, is more complicated and more interesting. Some people did indeed pray. The Benedictine monks had structured this exact pattern into their rule for centuries asleep, by around 7 in the evening, awake at 2 in the morning, for matins, the night office, the formal prayers that divided darkness, and then either continuing awake until dawn, or returning for a second sleep until the morning office of Lords. The monastic schedule was not invented to be difficult. It was built around a sleep pattern that already existed in the human body. The Church characteristically found a way to make a biological fact into a spiritual discipline, but outside the monastery walls the watch was considerably more varied than that. The French physician Laurent Joubert, writing in the 16th century, which is still very much within the era, Kirch examines, advised that married couples make love during the watch, not at the end of a long and exhausted evening. His reasoning was both practical and rather charmingly specific. They would have more enjoyment, he wrote, and do it better. One appreciates a medical man who understands his audience. There are records of people getting up during the watch to check on their livestock, to add wood to the fire, to brew malt or card wool by the faint light of a rushlight. There are records of neighbours visiting each other, yes, in the middle of the night, slipping out across dark streets to sit with someone for an hour and talk softly before the second sleep came. There are records of people writing by candlelight, studying, reflecting on the particularly vivid dreams that, as Kirch noted, tend to precede waking from first sleep. Chaucer knew this pattern. In the Squire's Tale, in his Canterbury Tales, the character Canacee sleeps soon after evening falls, wakes in the early morning, following what Chaucer simply calls her first sleep, and goes out to walk. Her companions, who had stayed up much later, were still fast asleep when she was already moving in the world. This is not a plot quirk. This is Chaucer accurately depicting the sleeping rhythms of his own time casually without explanation, because every reader in the 14th century would have understood it immediately. Now here is the piece of this that I find genuinely fascinating from a scientific standpoint, because history and biology meet here in a way that feels almost eerie. In the early 1990s, around the same time Kirch was puzzling over Jane Roth's testimony, in that London archive, a sleep researcher named Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States was running a different kind of experiment. He took a group of volunteers and removed them from all artificial light for 14 hours a day, essentially replicating the conditions of a pre-industrial winter night. No electric lights, no screens, just natural dark for 14 hours. Within a few weeks, every single participant had shifted into a biphasic sleep pattern. They began sleeping in 2 distinct phases, separated by 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. and during that waking period the researchers measured something remarkable: elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with states of deep calm and meditative relaxation that simply do not appear during ordinary daytime wakefulness. The watch was not just a historical habit, it was a biological state, a neurological mode, something the human body was, and apparently still is capable of entering when given the conditions that existed for almost all of human history before the light bulb. The participants in Vere's study described the watch as deeply pleasant, peaceful in a way that felt different from normal rest. One participant described it as being in an altered state, not quite sleep, not quite ordinary wakefulness, but something quieter and more expansive than either. Our ancestors had a word for this state. They called it the watch, and they built their entire relationship with the night around it. Can I ask you something honestly? When you wake up at 2 in the morning and you lie there in the dark, what do you do with that time? Most of us, I think, do one of two things. We either reach immediately for our phones, flooding our eyes with blue light collapsing the biological architecture of the watch in about 30 seconds, or we lie there getting increasingly anxious about the fact that we are awake watching the clock calculating how many hours of sleep we have left, building a mild internal catastrophe out of something that is in its deepest nature not a problem at all. Eckhart himself, when asked about this, was quite direct. He told interviewers that one of the most practical takeaways from his research was simply this: if you wake up in the middle of the night and cannot immediately return to sleep, stop fighting it. The anxiety you feel about being awake, the sense that something has gone wrong, is itself a modern invention, a product of an era that decided there is only one correct way to sleep. Before that era, waking in the dark was simply what the body did. It was expected. It was even in some accounts looked forward to. Russell Foster, a professor of circadian neuroscience at Oxford University, who has studied Eckert's findings extensively, put it this way: what is most damaging is not the interrupted sleep itself, but the anxiety we have about interrupted sleep. The broken night, as he calls it, is ancient. The shame we feel about it is entirely new. There is something else about the watch that I think deserves its own moment, a detail I find quietly moving every time I turn it over in my mind. Because of the watch, medieval people remembered their dreams far better than we do. Dreams that occur just before a natural waking carry a different quality than those we tumble past in our rush toward an alarm clock. They're more vivid, more textured, more present. And when you wake gently, naturally into the quiet dark, those dream images do not dissolve immediately the way they do when you're jolted awake by a sudden noise or a ringing phone. They linger. They have time to be held, examined, considered. Medieval people considered dreams to be genuinely significant, not as entertainment, as information. Thomas Aquinas wrote about dreams extensively, classifying them by their causes, some arising from physical states of the body, some from preoccupations of the mind, and some he believed from divine or demonic sources entirely outside the dreamer's control. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, composer and visionary, reported visions and dreams with the same matter-of-fact authority she brought to her medical writings. Medieval dream interpretation manuals circulated widely, and consulting them was not considered eccentric. It was considered prudent. When you wake from first sleep in the absolute silence of a medieval night with no traffic noise and no light pollution, and no buzzing devices, and your dream is still right there in the room, with you warm and detailed and strange, you have roughly 2 hours of quiet wakefulness in which to sit with it, to pray over it if it frightened you, to tell your bedfellow about it in low voices, to write it down by candlelight if you were among the small minority of the literate. The watch was the hour of dreams, and in losing the watch we lost something we've never quite found a name for. Here is perhaps the most unsettling part of this story. We know precisely when it ended. Not gradually, not over generations, but with a speed that in historical terms is almost violent. By the end of the 17th century, in the wealthiest city of Europe, London, Paris, Amsterdam, references to first sleep and second sleep were beginning to disappear from the written record, not replaced by another sleep vocabulary, simply gone, as if the concept had never existed. The historian Sasha Handley, who has studied this transition carefully, found that by the mid-18th century, a new and very different set of documents was appearing in the archive's advice literature about how to manage disturbed sleep. Books and pamphlets, and doctors' letters concerned with why people could not sleep through the night. The watch had not faded gently. It had become insomnia. What had changed between the medieval period and the 18th century? Two things working together in a way that neither alone could have managed. The first was street lighting. Paris introduced organized oil lamp illumination of its streets in 1667. London followed. The night began to contract. For the first time in human history, the city did not go dark when the sun went down. And where there was light, there was activity. Social life migrated into the evening hours. Coffee houses and theatres stayed open later. The wealthy who could afford candles and oil lamps discovered the delicious luxury of choosing to be awake when darkness said they should be asleep. And the second changed the clock. In the medieval period, time was approximate. You knew roughly what hour it was by the bells, by the light, by the rhythms of the body. Nobody was watching the exact minute. But as the early modern period brought more precise timekeeping, and as the Industrial Revolution brought factory schedules and shift work, and the brutal requirement that a specific bell at a specific hour meant the difference between a wage and a penalty, suddenly the night had to be managed. Sleep had to be consolidated. The ancient architecture of the watch was not compatible with a world that needed you at a particular place at a particular time, regardless of what your body felt ready to do. The watch did not die because people discovered a better way to sleep. It died because the world stopped having space for it. I want to leave you with one last thought before we move on. Every night, somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, there are millions of people lying awake in the dark who think they are failing at sleep, who feel broken, anxious, behind, inadequate, who scroll through articles about sleep hygiene and melatonin dosages and the proper temperature for a bedroom, searching for the thing that will fix them. What if the thing they are looking for is not a fix? What if some of them are not failing at sleep at all, but simply remembering something older and truer about the night than anything written in a modern wellness guide? I am not saying insomnia is not real. I am not saying that genuine chronic sleep disturbance is not a serious problem that deserves serious attention. It is, and it does. But I am saying this the next time you wake in the middle of the night and find yourself staring at the ceiling, quietly alert in the dark, before you reach for your phone, before you start counting hours, before you decide something is wrong with you. Consider the possibility that you are simply human, ancient human, the kind who used to lie in the dark and hold the remnants of a dream, and think slow, quiet thoughts, and wait in the stillness until the body decided on its own terms that it was time to sleep again. The watch, it never fully left us. And speaking of what the watch was actually used for, because we have been talking about the experience of it, the biology of it, the history of it, we have not yet talked about the most intimate details of what medieval people actually did during those hours. The prayers and the conversations and the tasks and the strange small rituals that filled that in-between time. Because the medieval night at home inside the walls, away from the watchmen and the curfew and the law, had its own world entirely. A world that was warmer, stranger, more human, and considerably more complicated than anything happening on the streets outside. Come inside with me. Right then, come inside. The curfew bell has rung. The streets are empty, or mostly empty, apart from one half-asleep watchman counting the hours. The house is shuttered, the fire is banked orange coals, and somewhere in the thick quiet of a medieval night, an ordinary family has gone to bed. This is the world we've been standing outside looking at. Now we step through the door, and here is where the story gets genuinely surprisingly intimate. We established in the last part of this journey that medieval Europeans did not sleep the way we do, that they naturally divided their night into a first sleep and a second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between that they called the watch. We talked about the biology of it, the history of its discovery, and the way it vanished. But what we have not yet done is actually go inside that wakeful hour. Actually sit with the people who lived it night after night for their entire lives, because the watch was not an abstraction. It was not a theory in a history book. It was one of the most personal private hours of the medieval day. And what people chose to do with it tells us something profound about who they were, and I think about who we are. Let me take you to a specific night, a specific person, a real story. Picture a Scottish weaver named John Cockburn. The year is somewhere in the mid-17th century, still firmly within the era of segmented sleep, still well before the Industrial Revolution swept the old night away. John has left us a record of a particular evening preserved in a legal deposition where he carefully described what he was doing and when. He had, as he told the court, gotten his first sleep, and was awakening from it when the night in question unfolded around him. What had he done during that waking hour? He had lit a candle from the embers of the fire. He had sat by the bed to check on his wife, who was unwell. They had talked quietly for a while, the way people talk when the house is still and the world outside has gone completely dark. Then he'd done some routine work at his lathe, and then perhaps an hour later, perhaps more, the familiar heaviness returned and he had gone back to sleep. That is the entire story. There is no drama in it, no great historical lesson, no heroic moment. Just a man waking in the dark, tending to his sick wife, doing a small amount of work by candlelight, and then sleeping again. And yet, it is one of the most quietly moving historical accounts I've ever read because it is so completely recognizably human. The concern in checking on someone you love, the particular intimacy of a conversation held in whispers in the small hours, the way ordinary tasks can feel almost meditative at midnight. John Cockburn did not think he was doing anything extraordinary. He was just living his night. Now, the watch looked very different depending on who you were, and I think this is a dimension of medieval nighttime life that rarely gets discussed, the way the dark hours were experienced so differently across the layers of medieval society that they were almost like different worlds happening simultaneously in the same darkness. For the peasant woman, the watch was rarely a luxury of quiet reflection. William Langland, writing his great poem Piers Plowman between 1362 and 1399, one of the most remarkable social documents of the entire medieval period, described the life of the peasant woman in terms so specific and so unsparing that they land differently when you read them with the watch in mind. He wrote of women rising in the winter night to rock the cradle, the baby awake and crying in the cold. Of women carding and combing wool by whatever faint light remained, fingers moving by feel as much as by sight because the rushlight barely reached the far corners of the room. Of women peeling rushes for the next day's tallow dips while the rest of the household slept. And he wrote of all this not as extraordinary labour, but as the texture of an ordinary winter night. The woe of these women. He said, and there is a rawness in that phrase that I do not think is exaggerated, who live in hovels. For peasant women, the watch was not a meditative pause in the rhythm of the night. It was simply another shift in a life of uninterrupted work. The darkness did not release them. It just changed the nature of what their hands were doing. Step up one rung on the social ladder and the watch begins to look different. For tradespeople, crafts, people, small merchants, the wide middle of medieval society. The watch was often the quietest and most productive hour of the entire day. A Bath physician of the 17th century actually advised students who needed to do serious intellectual work to do it after the first sleep, when, as he put it, they would be, in some measure, refreshed. This is not a metaphor or a general wellness suggestion. This was practical advice from a working doctor to people he knew. Do your hardest thinking at midnight. Your mind right after first sleep is sharp in a particular way. It has rested, it has metabolized the day, and it is operating in a silence that the medieval world had no other time to offer. The diarist Robert Sanderson, writing in the 18th century, described how on one particular night a barking dog had roused him from his first sleep. His response was not to lie there anxious not to fumble for a tincture or a potion to make himself sleep again. He sat up, packed and lit his pipe, and spent a comfortable hour thinking. Then he went back to sleep. This is recorded in his diary with the same emotional weight he might give to a pleasant cup of tea. It was simply what one did. There is something in that equanimity that I find almost enviable. Not the pipe, I am not recommending midnight smoking, but that absolute absence of alarm. The assumption that waking in the dark was simply a feature of existence, not a failure of it. For the literate scholars, clergy, wealthy merchants who had libraries, the kind of person who might leave a diary or a letter that survived the centuries, the watch was something more. It was writing time. We know from the texture of the historical record itself that a disproportionate number of personal letters and diary entries from the pre-industrial period were written at night. The handwriting is sometimes a little shakier, the candlelight visible in the way ink dried unevenly on the page. Scholars wrote in the watch because the household was quiet, the servants were asleep, the children were asleep, and the quality of thought available in those hours was genuinely different from what daylight allowed. One old English ballad, written we believe in the 16th century and recovered in fragments rather than in any grand archive, contains a passing line that I think is one of the most casually beautiful references to the watch in the entire historical record. It instructs a character, "At the wakening of your first sleep you shall have a hot drink made." Think about that for a moment. Not if you wake in the night, not treating wakefulness as an exception. At the wakening of your first sleep, as predictable, as certain, as inevitable as sunrise, and at that moment someone will bring you something warm. It is such a small domestic image, and it is somehow one of the warmest things I have ever encountered in a medieval source. Someone thought to put that in a ballad because it was the kind of thing everyone understood, because it was just life. Here is something I want to sit with for a moment because I think it matters. We have spent a great deal of the last century treating the 8-hour consolidated sleep block as both biological ideal and moral standard. Getting less than 7 or 8 hours of sleep is talked about with a faint note of personal failure, as if the person is not trying hard enough, not managing their life well enough, not taking their health seriously enough. Sleep in our time has become a performance. There is a whole industry built around optimizing it. The medieval world had no such anxiety. People slept badly sometimes. Records show this clearly. Insomnia, in the sense of genuinely being unable to sleep at all, was described and discussed in medical texts from the medieval period. Nightmares were taken extremely seriously, as we'll hear about later in this story. But simply waking in the night, simply being awake in the dark for an hour or two, this carried no stigma, no failure, no implication that something needed to be fixed. I find myself wondering what it might have felt like to lie down every night with the expectation that you would wake up at some point, and that would be fine. That you would have a quiet hour to lie in the dark and think, or to talk to the person beside you, or to get up and do something small and useful and then sleep again. Without a clock telling you how many hours you had left. Without a phone pulling you into the noise of the world. Without the particular modern shame of insomnia. I wonder if some of the sleep difficulty that so many people experience today is not purely biological. I wonder if some of it is the anxiety itself, the pressure of the performance, the knowledge that you should be asleep, that you are failing to sleep, that every minute of wakefulness is a minute you are falling behind. Our ancestors were not behind. They were just in the watch. There is one aspect of the midnight waking that I want to discuss carefully because it opens up something important about the texture of medieval intimate life, and because it has been mentioned in the historical sources often enough that it would be dishonest to skip over it. The watch was for many couples the most reliably intimate time of the night. Not simply in the sense of conversation, though, that was real and documented, but in the fullest sense of closeness between two people sharing a life. The French physician Laurent Joubert, writing in the 16th century, addressed this directly in his medical writing. He recommended the watch as the ideal time for marital intimacy, and his reasoning was specific. They would have more enjoyment, he wrote, and they would do it better. His explanation was physiological. The body rested and refreshed after first sleep, the mind quiet, the night not yet spent. It was the kind of frank, practical medical advice that the medieval and early modern periods were actually quite good at before a later era of Victorian prudishness descended and pretended that such things were not worthy of discussion. But here is what I find genuinely moving about this beyond the obvious. The historian Kirsch makes a point that I think is easy to underestimate. He writes that the watch in its intimacy and its quietness may have strengthened marital bonds in ways that the modern schedule actively works against. Think about it. A couple in the medieval period had a recurring built-in time every single night when the household was asleep, the day's labour was done, the children were resting, and there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be except right there together in the dark, talking, being close, in no rush. When was the last time you and the person you love most had an hour together with no screens, no obligations, no background noise, and nothing pulling either of you somewhere else, just the two of you awake in the quiet? That was every night for them. Of course not. Everyone had a person beside them. Not everyone experienced the watcher's warmth and connection. For those who lived alone, and medieval people did live alone, widows and widowers, travelling craftspeople in rented rooms, monks in their cells, the watch was something quieter and more interior. For the monks specifically, it was prayer. Not prayer as a vague spiritual gesture, but prayer as a precise, structured, demanding practice. The rule of Saint Benedict required Benedictine monks to rise for matins at approximately 2 a.m, which of course aligned almost exactly with the natural rhythm of first sleep ending and the watch beginning. This was not a coincidence. The monastic schedule did not impose an unnatural waking on sleeping bodies. It formalized a waking that was already happening. The monk Raoul Glaber, writing in the 11th century, described being visited by what he interpreted as a demon who whispered to him during this midnight waking, urging him to stay in bed and not answer the bell for prayers. "I wonder why you're so eager to jump out of bed," the voice said, "when you could give yourself up to rest until the third signal." Raoul recorded this as a genuine spiritual temptation, the demon of sloth, working in the specific vulnerability of the watch hour, when the warmth of the bed and the heaviness of the body made rising feel like an act of genuine will. I love this story not because it proves anything, but because it is so achingly relatable. That voice, the whisper to stay warm and let the world wait a little longer. Most of us have heard it, though perhaps without the theological framing, the internal negotiation with the alarm clock, the bargain with the cold morning. Raoul named it a demon, but honestly, the temptation feels like something any of us who has ever tried to do something difficult first thing in the morning would immediately recognize. The experience of the night, it turns out, was not so different across 1,000 years. The body wanted warmth. The voice said stay. The obligation said rise. What made Raoul different was that his entire community had organised itself around answering that bell, and that is where I think the medieval watch reveals something that goes beyond sleep habits or historical curiosity. It reveals a society that had almost by accident built a recurring moment of genuine reflection into every single night of its collective life. Not reflection as a wellness practice, not reflection as something you schedule on a Thursday morning between meetings. Reflection as a biological given. Reflection as simply what happened after first sleep before second sleep. In the dark and the quiet, whether you were a weaver in Scotland or a monk in Normandy, or a peasant woman in the English Midlands pausing between the cradle and the wool, every person, every night. 1 hour that belonged to nothing except what the mind and the body chose to do with it. We gave that up. Gradually and then, all at once, in the span of about a century, the watch disappeared. The lights came on, the clocks came out. The factory bell replaced the monastery bell, and consolidated sleep, one long block, no waking, no space, no quiet middle, became not just the norm, but the only acceptable form. And somewhere in the loss of the watch, I think we lost a kind of intimacy with ourselves and with the people sleeping beside us that has been surprisingly difficult to replace. Now, if the watch was the most private and intimate dimension of medieval nighttime life, it was not the only one. Because all the people we've been following, the peasant woman with her wool, the weaver awake beside his wife, the monk wrestling with his demon of comfort, they were all lying in beds that were themselves profoundly unlike anything we sleep in today. The medieval bed, it turns out, was its own complete world, and the rules of who slept in it, how, with whom, and what that meant for the rich and the poor, for the travelling stranger, and the lord of the manor, those rules are so different from what we assume that I suspect even history enthusiasts will find parts of this genuinely surprising. Something that tends to get lost whenever we picture medieval people at rest is a very simple but startling fact. The bedroom, as we understand it, a private room, your room with a door that closes in which you sleep alone, or with one other person you have chosen, is a genuinely recent invention. Not ancient, not traditional, recent. As in most of your great-great-great-grandparents would not have recognized it. The medieval bedroom was something else entirely, and the further back you go, the stranger and more fascinating it becomes. Let us start at the bottom of the social ladder, because that is where the vast majority of medieval people actually lived, and because their sleeping arrangements were so far from anything we would recognize that they deserve their own honest description. For a peasant family in 13th century England, which is to say for roughly 85% of the entire population, there was no bedroom. There was one room. One room for everything: cooking, eating, working, storing food, sheltering the smallest and most vulnerable animals when the winter was hard enough, and sleeping. The floor was packed earth or stone covered with rushes that were replaced periodically, but were never clean in the way we mean clean. The fire was in the middle, and the smoke went out through a hole in the roof when the wind cooperated, which it did not always do. The family slept on straw mattresses or on a simple wooden frame with ropes stretched across it, rope so tightly wound and carefully maintained that the phrase "sleep tight" most likely traces its origin here to the nightly act of checking those ropes before lying down. Over the straw went whatever coverings the family owned, rough woolen blankets, cloaks doubled up, occasionally a scrap of fur if they were fortunate. No sheets in the modern sense. No pillow in the modern sense. William Harrison, an Elizabethan traveller writing admiringly of how much softer his own era had become, described how earlier generations had slept with, in his words, a good round log under their heads instead of a bolster. A log for a pillow. I do not say this to romanticize hardship. I say it because I want us to sit honestly with the distance between that world and this one before we talk about everything else. The medieval peasant went to bed on a straw mattress under a rough blanket, with a log under their head, in a smoky one-room cottage where the rain came through the roof and the mice came through the walls. And they did this every night of their entire lives from birth to death, without a single reference point that would have suggested any other way of existing. Move up the social ladder to a craftsman's household, a minor merchant, a successful tradesperson in a market town, and things improve considerably, but perhaps not in the ways you would expect. The bed itself becomes real, an actual wooden frame properly constructed with a rope foundation and a mattress filled with wool or straw, or in prosperous households feathers. Feather mattresses were a genuine luxury, expensive enough to be specifically bequeathed in wills. In 1540, a woman named Marjorie Wren left her son Geoffrey in her will a red and green bed canopy. Apparently he already had the bed, which tells you something about how these items were valued and accumulated across a lifetime. You saved for a good bed the way we might save for furniture that we expect to outlive us and pass on. But here is the thing, even in this more comfortable middle-class household, the bed was not private. The family slept together. Not in the same room, in the same bed. A typical sleeping arrangement in a prosperous medieval family described in contemporary accounts had the husband and wife in the middle, with the girls arranged on the side nearest the wall, in order of age, the youngest nearest her mother, and the boys on the other side also in age order. Guests, when they came, joined on the outside edges. If you had servants living in the household, they might sleep on a truckle bed, a low frame on wheels that could be rolled out from under the main bed at night and stored underneath it during the day. Or they might sleep on pallets on the floor of the same room wrapped in their cloaks. The room was not large. The sense of personal space that we take completely for granted simply did not exist in this context, and nobody thought this was strange. That is the key point I want to linger on because I think it genuinely reframes how we understand medieval daily life. The crowded bed was not a compromise, not a poverty measure reluctantly endured. It was warmth, it was safety. It was the natural way of organizing bodies through a cold and dangerous night. The concept that a person ought to sleep alone, that solitude at night was desirable or healthy or even morally neutral, was essentially invisible to medieval thought. Now let us talk about what the medieval bed actually looked like for the people who could afford to make it something magnificent. The four-poster bed, that image of grandeur that shows up in every costume drama draped in rich fabric with curtains on all four sides, did not emerge as a common feature until the 15th century, probably arriving from Austria and spreading through the noble households of Europe over the following generations. But when it arrived, it transformed the meaning of the bed entirely. The curtains were not decoration, or rather they were decoration, but they were also architecture. They created within a large hall or chamber where servants and attendants might also be sleeping a completely enclosed microspace, a tiny room within the room. When the bed curtains were drawn at night, the lord and lady effectively disappeared behind a wall of heavy fabric, creating a degree of privacy that was otherwise essentially impossible in the medieval world. The bed curtains also created a microclimate. In a stone castle where the temperature in winter could approach freezing even indoors that enclosed space of human body heat, was the warmest place in the building. Some accounts describe four-poster curtains being so thick and effective that the space inside was almost oppressively warm compared to the air outside them. The servants sleeping on the floor 10 feet away were in an entirely different thermal world. And then there is the great bed of Ware. If you have never heard of this bed, you're in for a moment of genuine delight. It was built around 1590 Elizabethan era, technically outside our medieval window, but revealing something important about the long continuity of communal sleeping culture. It was commissioned by a carpenter named Jonas Fosbrook for an inn in the town of Ware in Hertfordshire, about a day's journey north of London. Its purpose was marketing, literally. The innkeeper had it built to be so spectacular so absurdly large that travellers would specifically choose to stop at his inn just to say they had slept in it. The great bed of ware measures 3 meters wide and nearly 3.5 meters long, more than 10 feet by 11 feet. It reportedly could and reputedly did accommodate at least 4 couples simultaneously. Shakespeare mentioned it in Twelfth Night. Ben Jonson mentioned it. Travellers carved their initials into the bedpost as a kind of early signature on a guest book, and those carvings are still visible today. The bed now lives at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where it arrived in 1931 as the single most expensive piece of furniture the museum had ever purchased, 4 times the entire annual budget of the furniture department. 4 couples in a bed built as a tourist attraction. The medieval world truly was something else. Here is a question I find myself wanting to ask anyone who reads about all of this. Does it make you feel claustrophobic, or does it make you feel something else? Because when I first encountered the full picture of medieval sleeping arrangements, the shared beds, the crowded rooms, the curtained enclosures, the servants on the floor, the guests on the edges, my first instinct was discomfort. The introvert in me recoiled. Where do you go when you need to be alone? What happens if you cannot sleep and you do not want to wake anyone? What about those nights when you simply want silence and space, and no one else is breathing in the room? And then I sat with it longer, and I started to notice something different. There was in this arrangement a particular kind of security that we've entirely traded away for our private rooms and our personal space. The medieval person going to sleep at night knew with absolute certainty that they were not alone, that the body of someone they knew, a spouse, a child, a sibling, even a servant who had worked in the household for years, was within arm's reach. That if something frightened them in the dark, there was a hand to reach for. That if they woke in the night from a bad dream, there was a voice to speak to. The historian who compiled all those references to the watch, Roger E. Kirsch, notes something in passing that I think has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in his work. He writes that in the pre-industrial world it was a rare person indeed who slept alone. Solitary sleep was associated not with comfort or privacy, but with poverty or exile or grief. The person sleeping alone was not the ideal. The person sleeping surrounded by warmth and breath and nearness that was the aspiration. We flipped that entirely. We made solitary sleep the gold standard. We made privacy the goal. I do not think one is obviously better than the other, but I do think we underestimate what was given up. Now I want to be honest about one dimension of the shared medieval bed that is not romantic in any way, because the historical record does not let you tell this story without it. Fleas and lice were part of the medieval bed in a way that is difficult to describe without using the word ubiquitous. Lice were essentially universal, present in the bedding of the wealthy, as well as the poor, removable only by constant laundering and careful combing, and considered an unfortunate fact of life rather than a sign of particular uncleanliness. The Elizabethan traveller mentioned earlier describes practices of sprinkling wormwood on mattresses to deter bed insects, which is both practical advice and a revealing window into what one was dealing with. Fleas, however, were different. Fleas carried with them the stigma of genuine uncleanliness. A flea-ridden bed was a social embarrassment, which tells you something interesting even in a world where lice were accepted as a feature of existence. People maintained standards. They had lines they drew. The flea was on the wrong side of that line. There is something almost endearing in that. The medieval household, crowded and draughty and smoky, and imperfectly lit, trying very hard to maintain dignity within the constraints of what was possible. Making the bed as warm as they could, keeping the linen as clean as they could manage, drawing a firm moral distinction between acceptable parasites and unacceptable ones. Human dignity expressing itself in whatever space was available. The bed also served at the highest levels of medieval society a function that will seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. It was a public space. For royalty and the highest nobility, the bedchamber was not a refuge. It was a court, a throne room, a boardroom. Henry VIII of England conducted informal business in his private chambers, relying on the trusted attendants of his bedchamber, a group called the Gentlemen of the Bedchamber, for counsel and companionship, in a way that blurred entirely the line between intimate domestic life and political power. The historian Anna Whitelock, who studied the bedchamber of Elizabeth I in remarkable detail, describes the ladies who attended the Queen at night not merely as servants, but as the most intimate, and therefore the most politically powerful women in England. And more publicly still, the birth of a royal child was for most of medieval and early modern history a witnessed event. Up to 40 people, nobles' attendants, officials' witnesses were present in the royal bedchamber to observe the moment of delivery. The purpose was not cruelty. It was proof. In a world of succession disputes and questioned legitimacy, having dozens of witnesses to a royal birth was the only guarantee that the child was who the parents claimed. You could not fake a witnessed birth. The historian Lucy Worsley, who documented this practice in detail, points out that this tradition persisted in the English royal family all the way until the early 20th century, when the parents of the current generation's monarchs quietly decided that the world had perhaps moved on enough that a royal birth could occur without an audience. The private bedroom, even at the very top, is a genuinely modern concept. The medieval bed, then, was not a place of solitary retreat. It was a place where the entire texture of a person's social world was present even in sleep, where children and servants and guests were nearby, where warmth was a communal project, where privacy, when it existed at all, was the draped curtain of a four-poster, creating a small sealed world inside a larger shared one. And in the morning, early before full light, because dawn was when medieval life began, those curtains would be drawn back. The servants would rise from the floor, the truckle beds would be rolled away, the family would emerge still warm into the cold of a new day that was already waiting. The night was ending. But there was another dimension of the medieval night that we have barely touched, yet one that operated alongside all of this sleeping and waking and dreaming. One that filled those dark hours with a kind of anxiety, a kind of dread that no warm bed and no number of trusted companions could fully address. Because the medieval bedroom was also a battlefield, and the enemy was not human. Let me ask you something personal before we go any further. Think about the last time you lit a candle. Maybe it was for ambience, for a bath, for a birthday cake, for the pleasure of a scent you like. You struck a match or clicked a lighter, and a flame appeared in less than a second. You probably did not think about it for even a moment after that. Now imagine that this flame, this small, warm, uncertain thing, was not a pleasure. It was a resource, like food, like water, something you measured out carefully, used deliberately, and thought about in terms of how long it would last and whether you could afford it. Imagine that the decision to light a candle at night was not casual but calculated. That darkness was the default state of existence, and light was something you spent. This was the medieval night. And understanding the true economy of light in the medieval world, who had it, who did not, what it cost, what it meant, opens up a dimension of this story that changes everything else. There was no single medieval candle. There were at least 3 entirely different tiers of nighttime illumination, each carrying its own economics, its own smell, its own quality of light, and its own social meaning. And the gap between the top and the bottom of that hierarchy was not small. It was the distance between sweet honey and rendered animal fat, between a clean, steady flame and a guttering, reeking smear of light that dripped and smoked and required constant attention. Let us start at the bottom because that is where most people lived. The rushlight. A rushlight was not really a candle at all in the way we understand candles. It was a dried rush, a common marsh plant found near water throughout England and much of Europe, stripped of its green outer layer, leaving only the soft white pith inside. This pith was then soaked in whatever fat the household could spare, leftover drippings from cooking, the fat trimmed from a carcass, whatever animal grease accumulated over the week. Once coated, the rush was held at an angle in a small iron clip and lit. The light produced was modest. More than modest, it was barely enough to see by. A single rushlight of average size burned for roughly 15 to 20 minutes. Not hours, minutes. To illuminate an evening of several hours by rushlight required planning multiple rushes in sequence, each carefully prepared, each used until the last possible moment before lighting the next. Gilbert White, the 18th century English naturalist who wrote detailed and affectionate accounts of rural life, actually measured rushlights with some precision. He calculated that a rushlight roughly 2 feet long would burn for 57 minutes, which means that an average household in rural England to have any light at all from dusk until a 10 o'clock bedtime in winter needed to burn through something like 5 or 6 rushlights every single evening, and every one of those required labour gathering the rushes, peeling them, soaking them in fat, drying them, storing them safely away from mice which regarded them as food and were correct. One step up from the rushlight was the tallow candle. Tallow was rendered animal fat, most commonly from cattle or sheep, boiled down until solid and formed around a wick of twisted fibre. Tallow candles burned longer and brighter than rushlights, and were the standard household candle for most of medieval Europe. By the 13th century, candle-making had become a formal guildcraft in both England and France, with the Tallow Chandlers' Company of London, forming around 1300 and receiving its official coat of arms in 1456. But tallow candles had a significant problem that nobody bothered to pretend was not there. They smelled, not faintly, not in a way you could politely ignore. The smell of burning tallow glycerin from the animal fat combusting in the heat of the flame was the smell of rendering fat, which is to say the smell of a slaughterhouse crossed with an overcooked kitchen. It was so unpleasant that several European cities actually passed ordinances banning the manufacturing of tallow candles within city limits, on the grounds that the smell was a public nuisance even before the candles were lit. If you have ever accidentally cooked animal fat at too high a heat until it started to smoke, you have the faintest possible approximation of what a tallow candle smelled like in an enclosed room. Medieval people burned these every evening for their entire lives and described them as perfectly normal, which tells you something important about the nature of habituation, and possibly also about how useful it is to remember that what feels intolerable to us today was merely unremarkable to people whose entire world smelled quite differently. The tallow candle also required constant maintenance. Its wick, made of unprocessed fibre, did not burn away cleanly, but built up a charred residue that had to be snuffed every 20 minutes or so, or the flame would gutter and smoke instead of giving clean light. A well-maintained tallow candle properly snuffed gave a reasonable light for hours. A neglected one dripped and guttered and threw shadows rather than illumination. And then at the very top of the hierarchy was beeswax. The beeswax candle was by the standards of the medieval world extraordinary. It burned cleanly without smoke, without dripping, without the need for constant trimming. Its flame was steady and bright, and it smelled faintly of honey, a smell so different from tallow that when you encountered it in a medieval church or a wealthy household, it signalled before you saw anything else that you were in a place of means. The church had claimed beeswax for itself with a theological logic that is, once you understand it, completely fascinating. Medieval liturgical writers taught that beeswax was not merely superior as a material, It was symbolically pure in a way that no other substance could match. The argument ran as follows: bees in the medieval understanding of natural history reproduced without what theologians called corruption, without the kind of physical union that characterized the reproduction of other animals. They were believed in the tradition of medieval bestiaries to be essentially virgin creatures, and because the bee was pure, its wax was pure, and the wax of a pure creature formed into a candle, its wick representing the soul of Christ, its flame representing his divinity, was therefore the only substance truly appropriate for burning on a Christian altar. Papal bulls formally decreed that tallow be excluded from altar candles. The high altar required beeswax. The paschal candle, the great candle blessed at Easter that represents the light of Christ, rising from darkness, had to be beeswax. And by the end of the Middle Ages, demand had outpaced supply so thoroughly that a single beeswax candle in Europe could cost more than a day's wages for a labouring man. Let me pause here, because I think this is one of those historical moments that rewards sitting with rather than rushing past. Imagine that your entire civilization's relationship with light, with the ability to see anything at all after dark, had a three-tier hierarchy. At the bottom, an animal fat-smeared rush that lasted 20 minutes and required constant replacement. In the middle, a candle that worked reasonably well but smelled like rendering fat and needed constant tending, and at the top a beautiful, clean, sweet-smelling candle that burned purely and steadily and was reserved by religious law for the church and by economic reality for the wealthy. Every time you went to Mass in a medieval church, every time you entered that space of soaring stone and coloured glass and incense and sound, the air smelled different than anywhere else in your world. It smelled of beeswax, of clean burning, of something that by the logic of its own production was considered spiritually pure. And then you walked back out into a world lit by 20-minute animal fat rushes. The sensory distance between sacred and ordinary space in the medieval world was enormous, and much of that distance was simply the difference between two kinds of candle. There is one more dimension of light in the medieval night that I want to discuss, and it is one that I think is easy to miss when we focus only on candles: the hearth fire. For the great majority of medieval people, the peasants and craftspeople and small farmers, who made up most of the population, the primary source of light in the home was not a candle at all. It was the fire. The same fire that cooked the food, warmed the room, heated water, dried wet clothing, and kept the family and sometimes the animals alive through winter. That fire burned through the night, banked under ash after curfew, but never fully extinguished, because relighting a fire from cold in the morning required real effort. The light of a banked fire is a particular kind of light. It does not illuminate. It glows. It produces warmth and presence, and a soft orange red that throws everything around it into a kind of amber unreality, rich near the coals, dark at the edges with shapes emerging and disappearing as the embers shift. It is not a reading light. It is not a working light. But it is, I think, one of the most ancient and emotionally resonant kinds of light that exists. We talk about firelight being relaxing, being romantic, being something we seek out for pleasure. But for medieval people, firelight was not a luxury or an aesthetic choice. It was the baseline. It was the state of existence. And when historians note that the pre-industrial bedroom was not completely dark at night, that people slept with a soft orange glow in the room, the faint warmth of coals in the hearth, they are describing this. Not candles, not lamps, just the last breath of the fire, which was always there, always present, always faintly alive. Now I want to tell you something about the economics of all this that I think changes how you see the entire medieval world. Because who controlled light controlled time? This is not metaphor. It is a literal description of medieval social power. When candles were expensive, only those who could afford them could work or read or conduct business after dark. The wealthy merchant could keep his accounts by candlelight. The scholar could continue his studies after sunset. The lord could hold council in his great hall by the light of many candles burning together. The peasant whose rushlight lasted 20 minutes and whose tallow candles were too costly to burn through an evening went to bed. This meant that the effective length of the working day, and therefore the effective range of what a person could accomplish, learn, read, or create, was a function of wealth. Not entirely, and not absolutely, but meaningfully. The aristocracy and the church quite literally had more day than anyone else, because they could purchase more of it from the darkness. This is why when people in later centuries began to talk about education and access to books as a great democratic equalizer, there was a real and specific sense in which they were right. A literate peasant in the 13th century who could not afford to burn a candle could not read at night. The knowledge in that book was in a very practical sense available to him only in daylight, and only in daylight he was not already labouring. Light was power, not as a slogan, as a fact of daily life. And here is where I want to introduce one last idea before we move to the next part of this story, because I think it is genuinely worth thinking about. We live in an era of almost incomprehensible light abundance. Our nights are not dark. Our cities glow so brightly that the Milky Way, the broad band of stars that was visible to every human being who ever lived before the 20th century, every night without exception is now invisible to more than a third of the entire human population of Earth. We have light pollution. The concept of too much light at night is a reality that would have been literally unimaginable to every medieval person who ever lived. And there is something quietly strange about that. The medieval night was dark, yes, sometimes dangerously, terrifyingly dark, but it was also full of stars. Every single night, a clear sky revealed more stars than most people alive today have ever seen in their lives. The Milky Way arched over every medieval village and city available to anyone who stepped outside and looked up. And people did look up. Medieval astronomy was not only a scholarly pursuit, it was practical navigational, and woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that the artificial night sky of our era has entirely erased. We solved darkness, but something went with it. Speaking of what went with it, there is one dimension of the medieval night that darkness shaped more profoundly than any other, more even than sleep or the economics of candles or the management of fire. It was the dimension of belief, because in the dark, in those long medieval nights, something moved. Something the watchman could not stop, something no candle could fully hold at bay, something that no amount of beeswax on the altar could entirely defeat. The demons came at night, and the medieval world had very specific, very detailed, and in some ways remarkably psychologically sophisticated ways of thinking about what they were and what to do about them. The word nightmare, the one you use casually when you've had a bad dream, the one children learn before they even understand what it means, is carrying something much older than you probably realize. The mare in nightmare is not a horse. It has nothing to do with horses. It comes from an Old English word mare, and before that from the Proto-Germanic maron. It means a creature, a specific kind of creature that medieval people believed descended upon sleeping bodies in the darkest hours of the night, sat upon their chests and pressed all the breath out of them, while they lay paralyzed and unable to speak, unable to move utterly, unable to defend themselves. The nightmare in its original meaning was not a bad dream. It was a visitation. We have spent the last several parts of this journey exploring the medieval night from the outside, the curfew bells, the watchman, the two-phase sleep, the economics of candlelight. Now we step into the deepest and most unsettling dimension of it, the part that lived inside the sleeping body, inside the dreaming mind, inside the particular terror that medieval people felt when darkness came, and they closed their eyes and made themselves as every sleeping creature must completely vulnerable. Because in the medieval understanding of the world, vulnerability at night was not simply a metaphor. It was a spiritual condition, and the forces that exploited it were real, not allegorically real, not symbolically real, but genuinely cosmologically real, in the way that fire and plague and famine were real. The night was when evil did its best work, and the sleeping body was evil's preferred point of entry. Let me tell you what medieval people actually believed happened when they slept. Not what we might charitably interpret as metaphor, what they genuinely believed. The incubus, from the Latin incubare, to lie upon, was a demon whose method of attack was exactly what the name describes. It came at night specifically during sleep, and it lay upon the chest of the sleeper with sufficient weight to cause genuine suffocation. The sleeper would wake, or rather would become partially conscious while still unable to move, a state that anyone who has experienced severe sleep paralysis will recognize with uncomfortable precision into a condition of complete physical helplessness. They could not cry out. They could not lift their arms. They felt the weight pressing down, felt the inability to breathe, felt the presence of something in the room that was not human. The 13th century physician Arnold of Villanova, one of the most sophisticated medical minds of his era, described the experience in remarkable clinical detail. The affected person, he wrote, knows that they cannot speak nor freely make a sound. They attempt to remove the perceived impediment, for they strive to rise up, call out and speak, and because they cannot, they exert themselves but find themselves constrained. That description, written around 1290, is an accurate and precise account of what sleep researchers today call sleep paralysis, a condition in which a person becomes conscious while the body remains in the muscular paralysis that accompanies the dream stage of sleep. It is now understood to affect somewhere between 8 and 50% of people at some point in their lives, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations, a sensation of pressure on the chest, and an overpowering sense of presence in the room. In the medieval world, there was no neuroscience to explain this. There was only the experience itself and an entire theological framework ready to explain exactly what it meant. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because I want to be honest about something that tends to get flattened when we talk about medieval superstition. The medieval medical establishment was not unanimously convinced that these night attacks were demonic. Arnold of Villanova, despite his vivid description of the symptoms, offered a physiological explanation. Eating raw foods before bed could cause vapors of fatty smokiness to rise within the body and block the heart and brain, thus producing the attack. The sleeping position matted on one's back was considered the most vulnerable. The warmth of the bedroom, the state of one's digestion, even what the medieval physicians called an excess of phlegm could all contribute. And yet the same medical writers who offered these practical explanations also acknowledged that some people genuinely believed with absolute conviction that what was sitting on their chest was not a bodily malfunction. It was something alive and malicious. There was a knight named Stephen of Hoyland living in the late 12th century who left behind one of the most detailed personal accounts of this kind of nocturnal suffering in the entire medieval record. He reported that for 30 years, an entire adult life, he had been attacked at night by a demon that would try to crush or suffocate him. 30 years of waking in paralysis, fighting something he could not see or grasp or name night after night, with no relief from medicine and no explanation from philosophy. What did he do? He had his servants sleep nearby so they could wake him by, and the historical record is specific about this, violently shaking him by his hair. When even that failed, he prayed to Thomas Becket, the martyred Archbishop of Canterbury, and the accounts say the attack stopped. I do not know what to do with that theologically or scientifically. What I know is that it happened to a real man, that it persisted for 3 decades, and that the only thing he found that worked after all the ointments and the position adjustments and the dietary advice was a saint. The medieval night had a texture of spiritual urgency that is genuinely difficult for us to recover from the outside, but the demonic dimension of the night was not only about sleep paralysis, which accounts for just one strand of a much larger web of nocturnal belief. In the medieval understanding of time and cosmos, night was quite specifically the hours when the devil and his agents were most active, not more metaphorically active, more actually physically present in the world. This understanding was not mere folk belief, it was theology. The Church had thought carefully about it, and it produced a daily practice that structured the entire rhythm of Christian life around the idea that the night had to be actively defended against not through locks and shutters which protected only against human threat, but through prayer and liturgy and the continuous human voice lifted against the darkness. This is the origin of the canonical hours, and understanding them properly, not just as a monastic schedule but as a theological defense system, changes how you read the entire medieval night. St. Benedict of Nursia, writing his famous rule in the early 6th century, divided the 24-hour day into 8 periods of prayer. During daylight hours, these occurred at prime, at terce, at sext, at none, and at vespers. Compline closed the evening after supper as darkness gathered. It was a prayer of completion of surrender and entrusting oneself to God's protection for the coming night. The text of Compline included the verse from the first letter of Peter, "Be sober. Be watchful, your adversary the devil as a roaring lion walks about seeking whom he may devour." Not the most soothing bedtime reading by modern standards, but in the medieval context absolutely necessary, because after Compline came the night, and the night required its own defence. At midnight, in the very heart of darkness, at the hour when the natural world was most completely surrendered to it, the monastery bell rang for matins, the night office. Monks rose from sleep or from the watch period between first and second sleep and gathered in the dark to pray, to sing psalms in the cold, to place the human voice deliberately and formally against the silence of the middle night. Why midnight? Because midnight was understood to be the hour of maximum spiritual danger, the darkest moment, the furthest from both the sunset that had ended the previous day and the dawn that would begin the new one. If evil was going to find a foothold in the human community, midnight was its best opportunity. And the monastic community's response was to be awake at midnight, singing, refusing to leave that hour unoccupied by praise. The 6th century scholar Cassiodorus wrote about this with a clarity that I find remarkable. The monks praying at night were not doing this for their own spiritual benefit alone. They were doing it for the surrounding community. The prayer said in the monastery in the dead of night were believed to form a kind of spiritual perimeter around the parish they served, a protective act for people who were sleeping and could not defend themselves. Do you find yourself wanting to ask whether any of this was really necessary? Whether the night actually contained demons? Whether the prayers actually formed any kind of spiritual shield? I think that is the right question to hold lightly, rather than answer definitively. Because here is what I keep returning to when I sit with this part of the story. The medieval night was genuinely dangerous. Not demons and incubi dangerous perhaps, but cold, dark, isolated, prone to fire, prey to disease, and deeply psychologically alien in ways that our lighted, warm, connected nights are not. When a person lying paralyzed in the dark, unable to breathe properly, unable to call for help, experiencing the hallucinated presence of something malevolent in the room, when that person reached for a theological framework to understand what was happening, they were reaching for the best available tool their civilization offered. And the tool that medieval civilization offered was in many ways remarkable for its sophistication. It did not simply say you are possessed, you must be exorcised. It said eat more carefully before sleeping, adjust your position, have someone nearby who can wake you. And also there are forces in the night that exceed human medicine, and the correct response to them is prayer community and the continuous maintenance of a human voice in the darkness. That is not so different at its core from what we would recognize as a combination of sleep hygiene advice and community support. The theology is different. The underlying insight about human vulnerability in the night and about the need to address that vulnerability with both practical and communal resources is not so different at all. The word complen comes from the Latin completorium completion, the end, the closing of the day and the committing of the self to whatever the night would bring. Medieval prayer books included specific prayers for compline that were quite direct about what was being asked: protection from dreams, from nocturnal wandering of the spirit, from the enemies that moved in darkness. One of the most moving aspects of compline, in my view, is that it was eventually not just for monks. By the high medieval period, lay people who could not read, who had no formal liturgical training, who would never enter a monastery or cathedral choir, had nonetheless absorbed the rhythm of the canonical hours into their daily lives through the sound of church bells. Every hour of the day, from prime to compline, was announced by bells, and people organized their working lives, their fields, their shops, their meals, their movements around those sounds. At the bell for compline, even a peasant who had never read a line of the breviary understood what it meant: the day is complete. The night begins. Commend yourself to God. There was in this a kind of collective architecture of protection. The monastery praying at midnight while the village slept. The priest saying compline as the fires were banked. The family murmuring its own prayers before the children settled. An entire civilization conducting in parallel an ongoing and intentional act of spiritual resistance against the dangers that the dark carried, both real and imagined. Whether those prayers did anything in the cosmological sense, I cannot say and would not presume to. What they undoubtedly did in the psychological and communal sense was give people a way to go to bed. Not merely a routine or a habit, but a genuine act of meaning in the face of genuine fear. The night for medieval people was not merely dark, it was occupied. And the response to that occupation was not silence, it was song. Now all of this, the prayers, the canonical hours, the spiritual perimeter of the monastery, against the dark, points to something we have not yet talked about directly. Something that existed halfway between the sacred and the dangerous, between the monastery and the tavern, between the canonical hours and the criminal night. The medieval city after dark had its own economy, its own rules, its own hidden population of people who, for reasons both compelling and questionable, could not or would not sleep when the rest of the world had gone to bed. And what happened in those streets, in those hours, in the places that stayed open when everything else had closed, that is its own remarkable story. If you walk through a medieval English town in the early evening after the curfew bell had rung, after the watchmen had taken their posts, after the respectable households had shuttered their windows and said their compline prayers, you would not be walking through silence. You would be walking toward light. Not much of it. But somewhere ahead of you through the dark there was a specific kind of glow, warm and amber and flickering just slightly in the draught of a barely closed door. And there was sound with it. Voices, not one or two, but several at once, low conversation, broken occasionally by laughter, the knock of a wooden cup on a wooden table, the general soft noise of human beings choosing not to sleep. The alehouse was open, and everything about that sentence, the alehouse open at this hour in defiance of curfew, or in creative negotiation with it, tells you something true and important about medieval nightlife that the official record tends to underplay. Let me clear up something that gets muddled almost every time people discuss drinking in the medieval world. because there is a genuine distinction between the three main types of drinking establishment, and understanding it changes the story considerably. The alehouse was the most common, in many ways the most extraordinary. By 1577 records show that there was approximately one alehouse for every 142 inhabitants of an English town, one for every 142 people. That density is comparable to modern pub culture in Britain, which means we have, depending on how you look at it, either not progressed very much in 500 years, or perhaps perfected something that was already nearly optimal. The alehouse was almost always a private home, not a purpose-built establishment with a signboard and a dedicated entrance, but someone's house specifically, in the vast majority of cases someone's wife. The alewife or brewster was one of the most important economic figures in medieval England, and one of the most consistently overlooked. She brewed ale from malted barley or oats using pots and vats that were standard household equipment. When she had a batch ready to sell, she hung a sign outside, not a painted sign with words because much of the population could not read, but an ale stake, a long wooden pole, or sometimes a bush of leaves that announced to the neighbourhood, "Come, I have ale, it is fresh today." The ale itself had to be sold quickly. Medieval ale unhopped hops would not spread significantly in England until the 15th century went sour within 2 to 3 days of brewing. This meant the alewife was not running a stockroom operation. She was selling a perishable product in a narrow window, which in turn meant that the alehouse was always a neighbourhood business, always local, always personal. The woman who sold you your ale was almost certainly your neighbour. She probably knew your children's names. Now here is the dimension of the alehouse story that I think is genuinely remarkable, and rarely told with the attention it deserves. The medieval ale trade was for most of its history women's work, overwhelmingly specifically women's work. Historian Judith Bennett, who spent decades studying the evidence from medieval manorial courts and town records, documented this in extraordinary detail. In the village of Brigstock in the 14th century, she found that the ale trade faced almost no significant male competition. Women dominated it, brewed it, sold it, regulated access to it. In Bridgewater, a woman named Denise Marlaire brewed commercially for more than 20 years, managed a successful business, and invested heavily in equipment and supplies. She was prosperous, independent. Her work mattered to her community in a practical, daily, irreplaceable way. The assize of bread and ale passed in England in 1266 regulated the quality and price of ale with remarkable specificity. It linked the price of ale to the current price of grain, created standards of measurement, and required regular inspections by ale tasters. These were real positions filled by real people whose job it was to go from alehouse to alehouse testing the product, not just tasting it for quality, but checking the measures, the pricing, the honesty of the operation, the fact that this system existed, that medieval England had what we might recognise as a form of consumer protection regulation for ale 650 years before the modern era, is both impressive and revealing. It tells you how central ale was to daily life, not as a luxury, not as an indulgence, but as a dietary staple. People drank approximately a gallon of ale per day, per person, including children who drank what was called small beer, a very weak brew, more grain water than alcohol throughout the working day, because water could not be trusted. The ale was safer. The brewing process involved boiling, which destroyed much of what would otherwise make the water dangerous. Every person who drank ale instead of raw water was, without knowing the bacteriology behind it, making a survival choice. The alewife, therefore, was not selling a vice. She was providing a public health service. But let us be honest about what the alehouse was also providing, because the historical record does not let us idealize it too much. The medieval alehouse at night was also a place of gambling noise and not infrequent violence. The game of hazard, a dice game roughly analogous to what we might recognize as craps, was the most popular gambling pastime in medieval English alehouses. Its rules were complex enough that disputes about them were probably regular, which combined with substantial quantities of ale, probably explains why the coroner's records from medieval England are, in the words of one historian, full of alcohol-related accidents, mishaps, injuries and murders. At Exeter there were regular complaints from the neighbours of a tavern called Beaufitz's about the noise made by the younger inhabitants of the cathedral close, who drank there late into the night and deprived respectable people of their sleep. At Colchester, a tavern owned by a man named Simon Fordham was identified as a specific venue for prohibited games of dice, and in London, where this period's version of conspiracy theories apparently flourished as reliably as they do in any era, the deposition records of the courts described how anyone seeking to hire what the records called a renter-wizard for purposes of magical harm against the king, or his ministers could, the deposition suggested, find one available for hire in any number of alehouses or taverns if one knew where to look. I love that last detail. Not because it is credible, it is almost certainly not, but because it tells you something about how the alehouse was perceived by official authority. It was the place where the shadow economy operated, where the things that could not be said in daylight were discussed, where if you needed something that the normal structures of society could not provide, you might find someone willing to provide it. Something important happened after the Black Death of 1347 through 1350, and I want to spend a moment on it because it reframes the entire alehouse story in a way that I find historically significant. Before the plague, commercial brewing was dominated by women. After the plague, men began moving into the trade. By the end of the 15th century in many major towns, the picture had shifted substantially. By 1600 in London, most commercial brewers were male. Why? It is not a simple answer. The Black Death killed roughly a third to half of the population of England, which caused a profound economic disruption, rising wages, greater capital accumulation, and a commercialization of trades that had previously been small-scale cottage industries. Brewing became more profitable, and as historian Judith Bennett argues with considerable evidence, when a trade becomes more profitable, men enter it. Not because they have new skills, not because their product is better, but because the economic incentive brings with it the social and legal mechanisms that gradually push women to the margins. The alewife, that central, irreplaceable figure of medieval neighbourhood life, was slowly transformed in the cultural imagination from a useful and respected community provider into a figure of suspicion and ridicule. Depicted in church art as the only category of person left in hell after the general redemption, satirized in ballads and poems as dishonest, physically disgusting, a temptress, corrupting, pious men. Shakespeare, in the induction to The Taming of the Shrew, names a character, Marian Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincott, as a specific comic type that his audience would immediately recognise. The joke lands because everyone knew what an alewife was, and the joke assumes she is slightly ridiculous. This transformation from essential service provider to cultural target is one of the clearer examples in medieval economic history of how a shift in market value reshapes social perception. The work did not change. The ale did not change. The women did not change. What changed was who wanted the profit it generated. Now the distinction between alehouses and taverns matters too, and not only economically. The alehouse sold ale, the tavern sold wine, and because wine in medieval England was imported primarily from France, from Bordeaux and Burgundy, and further south it was expensive, the tavern was not for the craftsman's family or the village labourer's evening. It was for merchants, for professionals, for the kind of person whose clothing alone cost more than a month of wages for anyone working the land. Geoffrey Chaucer understood this. His pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales gather at the Tabard Inn in Suffolk, which was a real establishment originally built by the Abbot of Hyde as a place for monks visiting London on official business and later open to more general travellers. The Tabard was by no means the grandest establishment in London, but it was a proper inn with food and beds and a stable, and the company it attracted was notably mixed, a knight travelling alongside a miller, a prioress sharing the road with the shipman. That mixing, that temporary democracy of the road, was one of the most socially interesting features of the medieval inn. Travel in a society otherwise rigidly organised by birth and rank created a strange permission. You could not choose your inmates. You had to eat at the same table, sleep in the same building, conduct your business within hearing of people whose station would normally require them to be invisible to you. Chaucer was not inventing the mixed company of the Canterbury Tales as a literary conceit. He was describing something that actually happened on the roads of medieval England every day. But perhaps the most interesting people in the medieval nighttime economy were neither the drinkers nor the gamblers nor the travelling merchants. They were the ones who had no choice but to be awake, the workers whose trade was defined entirely by the dark. The bakers of medieval cities are a remarkable case. Because bread was the staple food, and because it needed to be available at the start of the working day, the bakers had to begin their work in the deepest hours of the night. The ovens had to be heated, the dough had to be shaped, and proved the loaves had to be baked and ready. Which meant that in the hours when the watchmen were most alertly scanning the streets for suspicious figures, when the church bells were ringing for matins, when everyone who could be asleep was asleep, the baker was working. The English assize of bread, passed alongside the assize of ale in 1266, was remarkably specific about standards, prices, and weights of bread in relation to grain prices. Violations were taken seriously. A baker who sold underweight loaves could be dragged through the streets on a hurdle. His substandard loaf hung around his neck, a public shaming ritual that appears in the records with enough frequency to suggest it was genuinely enforced. The standards were real, the consequences were real, and the work that was being regulated was being done at 3 a.m. by firelight while the rest of the city slept. Here is something I find myself thinking about when I consider all of this: the alehouses and the taverns, the alewives and the gamblers, the bakers, and the night economy of the medieval city. We tend to imagine the medieval night as one thing, dark, dangerous, unanimously quiet after the curfew bell. And for the peasant in the countryside, for the family tucked into the watched period between first and second sleep, that characterization is largely true. But for the city, for any place where enough people were gathered in close enough proximity that some of them had business that could not wait for daylight, the medieval night was genuinely alive. Not in the way that a modern city is alive with its LED lights and its 24-hour economy and its endless digital noise, but alive in the older sense, in the sense of fire in the hearth and voices through the wall and the smell of baking bread 2 streets over and the sound of dice rattling on a wooden table. The people who operated in that nighttime economy were not for the most part the criminals that official records tried to make them. They were ordinary people doing ordinary things, providing food and drink and warmth and company to other ordinary people who needed those things in the dark, which is, when you reduce it to its essentials, what human community has always been. And yet there is one more category of person who worked the medieval night that we have not spoken of directly. The person whose work was the darkest, the most hidden, and whose presence in the historical record is most consistently filtered through someone else's judgment. The people whose labour took place entirely outside the law, outside the curfew, outside the acceptable economy of the medieval city, and who were often without any choice about it defining features of the night as much as any watchman or alewife or baker. Their story is next. Birth and death. Of all the events in a human life, these two, the arriving and the leaving, carry the most weight. And in the medieval world, both of them happened overwhelmingly at night. Not because anyone planned it that way, not as a custom or a preference, but because labour, like fever and like grief, does not respect the schedule of daylight. It comes when it comes, and when it came in the medieval world, it called out from the dark, summoning women who were already in bed, who had already said their Compline prayers, who'd been trying to have their first sleep before the bell rang for the watch. The midwife was the first professional of the medieval night. There is a phrase in medieval records that appears with particular frequency in the context of childbirth. It turns up in miracle collections, in court depositions, in ecclesiastical accounts. The phrase is simple: she sent for the midwife. Not she found the midwife. Not she waited for morning. She sent for her, in the night, through the dark streets with whatever light could be hastily assembled. Often just a neighbour roused from sleep to carry a message to a woman who was expected to be ready always at any hour regardless of the season or the weather. This was understood. This was the arrangement. The midwife slept lighter than other people, or at least she had to be prepared to. When the knock came, she rose. What the midwife walked into was a world defined entirely by women. Medieval childbirth was by custom, and by law, and by strong social convention, an exclusively female event. Male physicians did not enter the birthing chamber as a rule. There was a particularly extraordinary case in 15th century Belgium where a man named Henne van den Dam was actually fined 15 livres for hiding behind a staircase to eavesdrop on his own wife during her labour. The record stating with wonderful deadpan authority that this was a thing which doth not befit a man. He was fined for listening to his wife give birth, through a wall, from behind a staircase. That tells you everything about the degree to which childbirth was a sealed female world. Inside that world, the midwife's role was exhaustive. She brought with her whatever herbs she carried, preparations to ease pain, to speed contractions, to stop bleeding. She might employ a birthing stool which positioned the labouring woman in a way that used gravity to assist delivery. If the baby was not correctly positioned, she would attempt to turn it by hand, a procedure whose risk and difficulty are difficult to overstate in the context of no sterile instruments, no pain relief, and no ability to monitor what was happening internally. She might also bring protective objects. Some accounts describe her measuring the labouring woman's progress with a thread, then burning that thread as a wick during prayer to a saint asking for deliverance. The prayers were not theatrical. They were desperate. More than 1 woman in 3 died during her childbearing years in the medieval period. Not all from childbirth itself. Disease claimed many, but the birthing chamber was genuinely and statistically one of the most dangerous places a medieval woman would ever be, and into this danger came an additional specifically theological urgency that made the medieval midwife's night work unlike anything in the modern profession. If a baby was born in distress, struggling to breathe, clearly failing, the midwife had to make a decision with permanent consequences. A baby who died before being baptized was in medieval Catholic theology denied entry into heaven, not condemned to hell exactly, but consigned to limbo, a theological borderland that was not suffering but was not salvation either. The soul unbaptized was lost. This was not an abstract doctrinal position for medieval people. It was a lived terror. It shaped the entire rhythm of birth and its aftermath. The midwife was authorized by the church to perform emergency baptism if no priest could be reached in time. She was required to know the correct formula. She was instructed to memorize it and say it correctly, because a midwife's baptism performed with incorrect words was considered invalid, meaning the child's soul was still in danger, a theological technicality that once you understand it makes the entire weight of the medieval midwife's responsibility almost unbearable. She was not only delivering a body, she was making a decision in the dark about the eternal fate of a soul. Trotula of Salerno, the 12th century woman whose medical writings on women's health circulated widely in the medieval world, described forward-thinking approaches to pain relief in labour, recommending opiates and herbs in a way that was genuinely ahead of her time. Most midwives, however, were not literate. They learned their skills from the women who had taught them in an unbroken chain of practical knowledge that stretched back centuries, contained entirely in human memory and never written down, which means that what the medieval midwife knew she carried with her everywhere, into every dark house, every frightened room, every crisis that announced itself at 2 a.m, the fist on the door. Now let me ask you something. When you think about who was awake in the medieval night, who was moving through those dark streets carrying light, doing essential work, do you notice something? It was women. Over and over it was women. The alewife with her evening hours, the peasant woman rising from the watch to rock the cradle and card the wool, the midwife answering the door at midnight, and now as we turn to the other great event that called out from the dark, it is women again, the washers and the watchers. Because while birth pulled the midwife out of bed, death pulled out a different company. In medieval England, the Anglo-Saxons had a word for it, lich wake. Lich meaning corpse wake, meaning to keep watch. The like wake or corpse watch was the practice of staying awake through the entire night, sometimes multiple nights beside the body of someone who had just died before they were taken to the church for burial. This was not optional. This was not voluntary in the way that we might choose to attend a viewing. It was a deep social obligation woven into the fabric of how communities understood death, and it was grounded in both practical and spiritual reasoning that makes considerable sense once you understand the world it came from. The practical dimension medieval people knew from experience that someone who appeared dead was not always dead. The signs of death were not always clear. People were known to fall into states of profound unconsciousness, comas, seizures, the deep stupor of certain fevers that could be mistaken for death. The vigil was in part a watch, a genuine watching to see if the supposedly dead person stirred. This was not paranoia. Given the medical knowledge available, it was prudent. The spiritual dimension was equally real. The night after a death was understood to be a period of maximum spiritual danger, not only for the soul of the departed, but for the family left behind. Evil spirits moved most freely in darkness. The body of the recently dead, its soul not yet fully departed into whatever waited on the other side, was vulnerable. The candles surrounding it were not decorative, they were protective. Light against the dark, held deliberately and continuously. All through the night, the Scottish-like wake records from the later medieval and early modern period describe the practical arrangements, with the specificity of custom so well established it has become routine. The body was washed and prepared by women, always women this work too, belonging to the female domain of birth and death. It was laid out in the main room of the house. One relative and one stranger were required to watch together, and could be relieved by another pair when they grew too tired. In rotating shifts through the night, what did they do, those watchers in the dark? They sat with the dead. They prayed. They talked quietly about the person who had died, the stories about them, the memories, the small specific moments that accumulate over a life, and that grief makes suddenly precious. Sometimes they ate and drank because the night was long and the cold was real and ale was there to be had. The records from Scotland describe the like-wake sometimes becoming, as the night grew old and the watching wore on, almost festive. Games, jokes, songs, not as disrespect but as the natural response of living people pressed against death for hours, needing to assert their own vitality against the stillness in the room. This mixing of grief and laughter around the dead, which strikes modern sensibilities as strange, is actually one of the most ancient and cross-cultural responses to loss that exists. The medieval like-wake was not the sanitized, formal brief viewing that modern funeral culture has largely produced. It was a night spent in genuine intimacy with death touching it, watching it, sitting with it until the sun came up and the burial could proceed. The other figure who moved through the medieval night at the moment of death was the priest. Canon law in medieval Catholicism was unambiguous about last rites. The dying person was entitled to and required to receive final confession anointing, and the Eucharist before death if at all possible. These were not optional spiritual extras, they were sacraments, and without them the soul faced purgatory in a condition that could not be remedied after the fact by any amount of prayer from survivors. This meant that when someone was visibly failing, feverish, weakening, moving toward the boundary, the family sent for the priest, at whatever hour, in whatever weather. The priest got up. Like the midwife, the medieval parish priest was a night worker. Not by preference, not as a regular schedule, but as a recurring, unavoidable dimension of his calling. He walked the dark streets with whatever light he had toward a household where someone was dying to perform a ritual whose theological significance he genuinely believed could determine the eternal fate of the person in the bed. The accounts from miracle collections give us glimpses of these night visits that are, once you see them, impossible to forget. A woman named Alditha in labour for 3 full days, and nights reached the point where the priest was called to administer last rites, not for the baby, but for her, the mother who was now dying of what the labour had taken from her. The priest came. He brought with him a relic of Thomas Becket, a stole. He wrapped it around the dying woman, and the accounts say she survived. What I find remarkable about that story is not the miracle. It is the fact that a priest in possession of a precious relic came in the night to a woman who was failing and used everything he had, theology and prayer and cloth, in service of her life. What begins to emerge when you look at all of this together, the midwife and the like watcher and the priest in the night, is a portrait of the medieval community as something genuinely different from what we tend to imagine. We think of the medieval world as individualistic in its faith and its suffering, the lone soul before God, the personal judgment, the private conscience. But the medieval night tells a different story. When someone was about to be born, the neighbourhood women came. When someone was dying, the priest came. When someone had died, the family and a stranger kept watch together all night long. No one passed through the crisis of birth or death alone. No one was expected to. The dark was too large, the stakes were too high, and the community had a collective obligation to be present. The lich wake, that extraordinary word that has softened over centuries into the modern wake, is still with us. We still sit up with the dead before we bury them, still gather the living around. The lost still mark death as a communal event that belongs to everyone who loved the person. The specific theology has changed. The candles are now electric and the prayers are different, and the priest may or may not come. But the impulse to be present, to watch, to not let the night pass without witnesses, that has not changed at all. The medieval nighttime community understood something that we are only now very slowly beginning to remember, that the moments of maximum human vulnerability, birth, death, the long watches of grief are not occasions for privacy. They are occasions for presence. Someone needs to stay awake so that others can sleep. Someone needs to hold the light. And yet for all the midwives and priests and like watchers and alewives and bakers we have walked beside tonight, we have not yet spoken about what happened to the night itself. What happened to the long darkness of the medieval world when the very technology of seeing changed, when fire stopped being the only answer to darkness, when one invention, small, quiet, seemingly trivial, began to dismantle 1,000 years of nighttime culture in the span of a single human lifetime. That story is coming next, and I think it is one of the most important and most underappreciated turning points in all of human history. Sometime in the 1780s, the exact year is not recorded, but historians have traced the shift to within a decade. Something changed in the way educated upper-middle-class Londoners and Parisians talked about sleep. Not what happened during sleep, not the content of dreams or the rituals around bedtime. The language itself changed. The vocabulary of sleep changed. The phrases first sleep and second sleep, which had appeared in diaries, medical texts, court depositions, legal documents, love letters, ballads and novels without explanation or commentary, for at least 700 years, simply because everyone who read them already knew exactly what they meant, began to disappear. Quietly, without announcement, without anyone saying we've decided to stop sleeping this way. They just stopped appearing. By the 1830s, they were essentially gone from the written record. Something, or rather several somethings, had happened to the night. To understand what those somethings were, we have to go back exactly 1 century earlier, to Paris in 1667, and to a man named Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie. De la Reynie was the first Lieutenant General of Police of Paris, appointed on March the 15th of 1667 by the Sun King Louis XIV, who had decided that his capital was an embarrassment. The crime rate was appalling. 2 senior law enforcement officials had died recently under suspicious circumstances. The streets of Paris after dark were genuinely dangerous in a way that humiliated a monarch who was positioning himself as the greatest ruler in Europe. De la Reynie's mandate was sweeping clean up the streets, quadruple the police force, impose order. And among his first, most lasting and most consequential acts was this: he hung lanterns. Not a few lanterns in a few prominent places. 3,000 lanterns suspended on ropes stretched across the main streets of Paris, 15 feet above the cobblestones, spaced at regular intervals so that a traveller moving through the city could walk from one pool of light to the next without ever fully stepping into complete darkness. By 1702 there were 5,400 public candle lanterns burning in Paris from October through March. A medal was struck to commemorate the achievement with the Latin motto Urbis Securitas et Nitor, for the security and illumination of the city. And with that medal, the old night began to die. The dates that followed tell the story with remarkable speed. Paris introduced organised street lighting in 1667, Lille the same year, Amsterdam in 1669, Hamburg in 1673, Turin in 1675, Berlin in 1682, Copenhagen in 1683, London between 1684 and 1694. By 1700, not a single major European city still went fully dark at night. In the span of 33 years, barely one human generation, the fundamental condition of urban nighttime had been transformed. Think about what that means. For literally thousands of years the night had been dark. Not mostly dark, not dim, dark. The kind of darkness we discussed at the very beginning of this journey, absolute, disorienting, dangerous, full of invisible hazards and imagined presences. That darkness had shaped everything: the curfew laws, the night watch, the biphasic sleep, the canonical hours, the fear of demons, the reliance on firelight, the economics of candles, the midwife's route to the next birth, the like watcher's vigil. All of it had grown up in response to one simple, ancient, apparently permanent fact that the night was dark. And in 33 years across an entire civilization that fact ceased to be true. The world that had taken 1,000 years to build had in a single generation its foundations quietly removed. Now I want to be precise here, because the story of how light killed the medieval night is not as simple as the lights came on and everything changed. The relationship between artificial light and human behaviour is layered and interesting in ways that I think are worth sitting with. The first lanterns of 1667 Paris were not bright, not by any modern standard. A tallow candle in a glass box suspended 15 feet above the street illuminated roughly a circle of cobblestones beneath it, and very little else. Walking from one lantern to the next, you still passed through meaningful darkness. The fear of what moved in those intervals did not evaporate instantly. What changed was not so much the quality of the light as the social permission the light represented. Before, the lanterns being out after dark was, as we have discussed at length, effectively illegal, or at least deeply suspect. After the lanterns, it was gradually, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, normal. The historian Craig Kozlowski, who has written perhaps the most comprehensive account of the transformation of European nightlife in the early modern period, uses a phrase I find both precise and evocative: the nocturnalization of European society. He means the deliberate planned extension of social life into the hours that had previously been reserved for sleep, prayer and fear. Theatres began to hold evening performances. Coffee houses stayed open past 10 at night. Shops lit their windows. The wealthy began to hold suppers at hours that would previously have been deep into the first sleep. Being seen in public after dark in a well-lit street began to signal not criminality but sophistication. The night, for the first time in human history, was becoming fashionable. But fashion was only one piece of this. The more permanent and more transformative piece came a century later, and it smelled of coal, gaslighting. The ability to pipe flammable gas from a central source through buried pipes to burners attached to lampposts and interior fixtures. It produced a light that was not one candle in a glass box, but something closer to a steady, reliable, relatively bright illumination that could be maintained continuously through the night without anyone carrying oil up a ladder to refill it. In Paris, gaslighting reached the streets in 1829, beginning with the Place du Carrousel and the Rue de Rivoli. By 1857, a Parisian writer enthused that the new gas illumination of the Grand Boulevard from the Church of the Madeleine all the way to the Rue Montmartre produced 2 rows of lamps with a clarity white and pure that created a marvellous effect. London had gas lighting on Pall Mall as early as 1807. Baltimore in the United States became the first American city lit by gas in 1816. Each of these dates marked not just a change in the infrastructure of the city, but a change in what people believed the night to be. With gaslighting, streets that had been dark for all of recorded history were now reliably, consistently illuminated. The night lost its opacity. The night became, for city dwellers, a place you could navigate by sight. And when that happened, the last social barriers against nighttime activity fell. Here is where I want to ask you a specific question, because I think it illuminates something important. When you think about the Industrial Revolution, the factories, the machinery, the transformation of labour and economy, do you think about sleep? Most people do not. But what Roger Kirch argues, and what the historical record appears to support quite clearly, is that the Industrial Revolution did something to human sleep that was at least as significant as everything it did to labour. It consolidated it. It compressed it. It turned it from a fluid, biological, naturally segmented experience into a single block of allocated time positioned between the end of one productive period and the beginning of the next, optimized for efficiency rather than for human biology. The Earliest Rising movement. A reform movement that emerged in Britain and the United States beginning roughly in the 1830s promoted early rising as a moral virtue, not a medical recommendation, a moral one. The person who slept in was lazy. The person who required more than one continuous block of sleep was weak. As Kirch put it, people in urban areas, particularly middle-class people, were absorbing the values associated with industrialization, ambition, profit-seeking, efficiency, punctuality. And a central casualty of those values was the watch, the quiet, unproductive, unmeasurable hour between first and second sleep, the hour for reflection and prayer and quiet conversation, and the contemplation of dreams was not compatible with a world organized around the clock. The clock, more than the lantern, was the true enemy of the medieval night. Levi Hutchins of New Hampshire built the first mechanical alarm clock designed specifically to rouse a person for work in 1787. He built it for himself because he needed to be at his shop at 4 a.m. and could not trust his body to wake at the correct moment. The clock could not be adjusted, it rang only at 4, not at any other time, but the principle was established. The body's natural waking rhythms were now subordinate to the mechanical requirements of scheduled labour. By 1876, Seth Thomas was mass-producing adjustable alarm clocks in the United States. By the early 20th century, factory workers who arrived late because their alarm clocks had stopped working were docked pay. During the Second World War, the American government actually lifted a production ban on alarm clock manufacturing, designating them as emergency items, because workers without functioning clocks were sleeping through factory shifts that were considered essential to the war effort. This is the world we inherited. Not gradually and not inevitably, but through a series of specific decisions, specific technologies, and specific cultural choices made in a relatively short period of time, the old relationship between human beings and the night was dissolved. The darkness that had shaped our sleep for thousands of years was first illuminated and then abolished. The biological rhythms that had produced the watch, the first sleep, the second sleep, were overridden by the alarm clock and the factory bell. The social life that had organised itself around the fire, the church bell and the early darkness, was reorganised around the lamp, the clock and the productive working day. And in the space where all of that used to live, the long-inhabited, community-filled medieval night, we put insomnia. I'm not being entirely flip about that. The evidence is quite serious. The first clinical descriptions of what we would now call chronic insomnia as a distinct and widespread disorder begin to appear in the medical literature in the mid to late 19th century. Not coincidentally, this is precisely when the transition from segmented to consolidated sleep was being most aggressively enforced by the combined pressures of artificial light factory schedules, school attendance requirements, and the moral culture of the early rising movement. Before that transition, waking in the middle of the night was simply what happened. After it, waking in the middle of the night became a disorder. The watch, that ancient, biologically natural, culturally rich interlude that medieval people used for prayer and intimacy and reflection, and the contemplation of their dreams, became in the medical vocabulary of the industrial age a symptom, something to be treated, something to be corrected. Something that stood in the way of the efficient, consolidated, clock-ready sleep that a productive industrial citizen was supposed to maintain. Roger Akirch, whose work has framed so much of this story, stated it plainly. One reason why some people suffer from what has been termed middle-of-the-night insomnia is that many individuals are experiencing a powerful remnant and echo of this long dominant pattern of biphasic sleep. The body remembers what the culture has forgotten. Now I want to end this particular section of our journey with something that I think is genuinely worth holding. We tend to frame the story of the night as a story of progress. Darkness conquered, danger removed, freedom extended, the night made safe and available and democratic, and there is real truth in that framing. Medieval darkness killed people in falls from unfamiliar paths, in fires, undetected until too late in the simple inability of the midwife to see the road to the next birth clearly enough. The safety that artificial light brought to the night was and is genuinely valuable, but alongside those gains, something was lost that we've not fully come to terms with, a particular kind of intimacy with darkness. A relationship with the night as a specific, bounded, sacred space, different from the day, governed by different rules requiring different things of us. The medieval night demanded presence and attention and community. It demanded that people be awake to it, not merely asleep through it or distracted past it. We replaced the watch with the phone. We replaced the quiet interlude between first and second sleep with anxiety about whether we are getting enough hours. We replace the sounds of the city giving itself over to darkness with 24-hour noise and light that never fully stops. And somewhere in that replacement, I think we lost the ability to be genuinely, productively, restoratively alone with ourselves in the dark. The night used to teach people something. Something about limitation and patience and the value of small lights. Something about community, that no one should pass through darkness alone if it could be helped. Something about the body and its rhythms, which are older and wiser than any clock ever manufactured. The lights came on, the darkness retreated, and what moved in to fill the space it left behind is still, I think, not quite what we had before, which brings us almost to the end of our journey through the medieval night. We have travelled through its legal structures and its sleeping bodies, its alehouses and its canonical hours, its candles and its demons, its midwives and its like-watchers and its watchmen calling the hours. We have seen what the dark cost and what it gave. But before we close, before we let the second sleep come, there is one more thing I want to give you. Not a historical fact or a scholarly argument, but a reflection. A way of thinking about everything we have been through tonight that I hope will stay with you a little longer than the rest. Because I think there is a lesson in the medieval night that we have not fully named yet, and it has nothing to do with history. There is a child being born somewhere in the world right now today who will only be able to see half the stars that are currently visible in the night sky by the time they turn 18. Not because of clouds, not because of weather, because of light. According to research published in 2023, the brightness of the artificial night sky has been increasing at roughly 10% per year for the past decade. A child born into the world today will inherit a sky that is, by the time they reach adulthood, meaningfully dimmer in stars than the one they were born under. Not a catastrophic dimming, not the kind you would notice on any given night. Just a slow, steady erasure of points of light year by year, until the things that were visible become invisible, and most of us will not notice, because most of us have never seen a genuinely dark sky to begin with. We have been travelling through the medieval night for many hours now. We have walked its dangerous streets, slept in its communal beds, drunk its ale, prayed its prayers, watched over its dead and argued about the meaning of its shadows. And somewhere along the way, I hope you have come to understand that the darkness was not merely an absence of what we have now. It was a presence, a specific kind of environment, with its own demands and its own gifts and its own texture that shaped human behaviour in ways we are only now beginning to measure scientifically. And the numbers that science is producing are genuinely striking. According to the First World Atlas of Artificial Night Sky Brightness, a report published in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, 2/3 of the population of the United States and more than half the population of Europe have already lost the ability to see the Milky Way with the naked eye. Not because they have never tried, because the sky above them is simply too bright for the galaxy to be visible. 99% of Americans and Europeans live under what scientists classify as light-polluted skies. 99%. This is the sky that every medieval person we've discussed tonight looked up at freely every clear night for their entire lives. Without knowing it was remarkable, without needing to travel anywhere special or pay for the experience or consult a map to find it. They simply stepped outside and the universe was there. Now I want to be very careful here because this is the point in the story where it is easy to tip over into a kind of sentimental medievalism that the history does not actually support. I am not suggesting that medieval people had better lives because their skies were dark. They did not. Their lives were harder in ways that are genuinely difficult to convey: the cold, the disease, the mortality, the constant physical labour, the legal powerlessness of most people over most decisions about their own existence. The lights came on and the darkness retreated, and real human suffering was reduced as a result. That is true and it matters. But something else is also true and also matters: the human body was built for that darkness. built by millions of years of evolution in exactly those conditions, cycling day and night, resting and waking in rhythms tied to the actual movement of light across the sky. And we have, in the space of roughly 150 years, removed those conditions almost entirely for the majority of the world's population, and the body has not caught up. The circadian rhythm, the 24-hour biological clock that regulates sleep hormone production, immune function, metabolism, mood, and a dozen other essential processes, requires actual darkness to function properly, not dim light, not the ambient glow of a city skyline filtering through curtains. Darkness, the kind that tells the brain it is night. The melatonin can rise now. The immune system can begin its nightly maintenance work. You can rest. Instead, most of us sleep in rooms that are never fully dark, where the standby light on the television glows red, where streetlights press through blinds that were never quite designed to stop them, where the phone screen which we've placed on the nightstand because we use it as an alarm pulses occasionally with notifications that part of the brain registers even in sleep. This is not what the medieval darkness looked like, and the body still knows the difference. Do you want to know something that I find both disturbing and fascinating in roughly equal measure? The Amish population of the United States communities who have deliberately maintained a way of life that excludes electricity and therefore experience something much closer to the natural light-dark cycle of earlier centuries has a remarkably low incidence of major depression. Researchers are careful to note that this correlation involves many factors, not only light exposure, but the data is notable enough that it has attracted serious scientific attention, and the light-dark cycle is considered a significant contributing variable. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified shift work that routinely disrupts the natural light-dark cycle by requiring people to be awake and active during the hours of biological darkness as a probable human carcinogen. Not definitively established as causing cancer, probably, based on the evidence accumulated across decades of epidemiological research. Research from Harvard University published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute found elevated breast cancer risk among women who had worked rotating night shifts for 30 or more years. Studies at Vanderbilt University found that exposing newborn mice at a developmental stage comparable to 13-week-old human fetuses to constant artificial light for several weeks left them unable to maintain coherent circadian cycles, and suggested a possible link to increased risk of depression and mood disorders later in life. The researchers who conducted that study noted, "All this is speculative at this time, but certainly the data would indicate that human infants benefit from the synchronizing effect of a normal light-dark cycle." A normal light-dark cycle. The thing that every medieval peasant had automatically without doing anything to obtain it, simply by the fact of living before the Industrial Revolution. Now I want to pause here and ask you something genuine. When did you last experience real darkness? I mean the kind we've been discussing throughout this journey. Not your bedroom with the curtains drawn and the phone turned face down, but actual darkness. The kind where your eyes adjust and keep adjusting, and you still cannot quite see your hand in front of your face. The kind where the stars are not dots but a cloud, a river, the thick, improbable band of the galaxy stretching from horizon to horizon. Most people I know have had this experience at most a handful of times in their adult lives. A camping trip, a remote beach on a clear night, a power outage that lasted long enough for the neighborhood to go truly dark. Maybe never, for those who've grown up in large cities and have rarely left them, and the reported experience almost universally is the same. Or that specific variety of emotional response, the simultaneous feeling of smallness and belonging, of being reduced to appropriate scale, of being reminded that you are a creature among creatures in a universe that does not need you to keep it running, That experience, which philosophers and psychologists have studied extensively, and which appears to be genuinely beneficial for human well-being, is reliably triggered by genuine darkness and a genuinely dark sky. A paper published in 2024 in the Journal of Environmental Psychology, describing what the researchers called the Night Sky Connectedness Index, found that people who reported a strong sense of connection to the night sky also reported significantly better mental health, greater happiness, and a stronger sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. This is what medieval people had every night, without knowing it was rare, without labeling it or measuring it or writing journal papers about it. They just stepped outside and the universe pressed down on them with all its weight, and they were part of it. There is a growing movement in the world right now, quiet, underfunded, somewhat idealistic, and I suspect enormously important, called the Dark Sky Movement. Its work is practical lobbying governments and municipalities to adopt better outdoor lighting standards that direct light downward rather than upward, to use wavelengths that affect wildlife and human biology less severely to shield street lamps so that they illuminate roads rather than the entire sky above them. By 2024, there were more than 220 certified international dark sky places around the world. Parks, preserves, reserves where the protection of natural darkness has been made an explicit policy goal. Dark sky tourism has become a recognizable travel trend, with people booking specific trips to places remote enough that the galaxy is visible overhead. This is remarkable when you sit with it. We have reached a point in human history where experiencing the sky that all of our ancestors took for granted requires travel planning and expense, where seeing the Milky Way, which shaped mythologies and navigational systems and the spiritual lives of entire civilizations across all of recorded time, is now an event you schedule in advance. I find this both quietly absurd and deeply moving at the same time. Let me connect this back to the story we've been telling all night. We began this journey by stepping into a medieval town after sunset and asking, what did these people do in the dark? And the answers turned out to be everything. They slept in 2 phases and woke between them for prayer and intimacy and reflection. They organized their community around shared fire and shared watch and shared vigil. They built the entire social architecture of their nighttime lives around the fact that the dark was real and permanent and required adaptation rather than elimination. They were afraid of it, yes. They filled it with demons and prayer and the ringing of bells, but they were also in it truly and inescapably in it in a way that we are not. And what is emerging from the science, slowly, carefully, still being debated and refined, is the suggestion that some of what we lost when we lit the night may not be merely cultural. It may be biological, that the body genuinely needs the dark the way it needs food and water and rest. Not the dark as an aesthetic experience, though that matters too, but the dark as a signal, as information, as the thing that tells 1 billion years of cellular machinery it is time to stop now. It is time for the processes that happen only in the absence of light. It is time to repair and consolidate and prepare. The circadian rhythm is not a preference. It is not a lifestyle choice. It is a deep structural feature of every cell in the human body, maintained by a tiny cluster of neurons in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, fewer than 20,000 cells, smaller than a grain of rice, that have been keeping time for longer than our species has existed. They are exquisitely calibrated to the natural light-dark cycle. They were shaped by it across evolutionary time, and we have, in the span of a few generations, removed the primary input those cells were designed to receive. What does it mean to run a clock in an environment it was never designed for? We are finding out. Here is something that I think about sometimes in the particular small hours of the night when my mind runs slow and honest. The medieval person who lay awake in the dark during the watch that hour, between first and second sleep, holding the remnants of a dream, listening to the silence, maybe reaching for the person beside them, was doing something that we've almost entirely lost the capacity for. This is comfortable in the dark, not fearless, not indifferent to its dangers, but comfortable. They knew the dark as a space they inhabited, a space they had always inhabited, a space that was theirs as much as the daylight was theirs. The night was not the enemy of their lives. It was the other half of their lives, the part that did different work, the part that asked different things. We have built a world where the dark is never allowed to fully arrive, where the night is simply a dimmer version of the day, still lit, still connected, still noise-producing, still requiring us to manage and respond and stay available. We've extended the day indefinitely at real biological cost, at real psychological cost, at a cost to our relationship with awe and reflection and genuine rest that is only now beginning to be measured. And the medieval dark, for all its dangers, for all its demons, for all its cold and its isolation and its risk, held something that we are spending considerable money and travel time now trying to find again. The stars were always there. The darkness was always there. The body's need for both was always there. We just turned the lights on and forgot what we had when they were off. And now, after all of this, after every cobblestone street and watch hour and prayer bell and alewife and light watcher and sleeping arrangement, we have encountered tonight, we are very nearly at the end of our journey through the medieval night. But not quite, because everything we have discussed, all the layers of this world, we've been excavating points toward one final thing that I want to give you before the second sleep comes. A way to carry this with you. A use for everything we have found in the dark. We have been in the dark for a long time tonight. 12 journeys through a world that most of us have never visited and can barely imagine. 12 windows into a night that was simultaneously more dangerous and more alive than anything we experience today. 12 hours in story time at least spent walking beside people who are not here to speak for themselves, reconstructed from court records and medical texts and legal depositions and midnight prayers, and the quiet confessions of historians who spent decades in archives, following a trail of candlelight backward through time. And now we're almost at the end. Not of the night as we've seen has its own schedule, and it does not consult us before deciding when to end. But almost at the end of what I want to give you. So let me try to do something a little different for these final minutes. Let me try to say what I think this story actually means. There is a question I've been circling around since the beginning of this journey, and I want to finally ask it directly. What did the medieval knight know that we have forgotten? Not about technology. That question is easy, and the answer is simply that we know more and they knew less. Full stop, no contest. We would all rather have antibiotics and indoor plumbing and reliable lighting. That is not the question. The question is this: what did that world understand about being human in the dark that we have in the process of solving? The dark lost the capacity to understand. I keep returning to a specific detail from King Charlemagne's court in the 8th century. Not a battle or a conquest or a coronation, those are abundant in the records. This detail the court scholar Alcuin, writing about the emperor's children and their education, mentions in passing a daughter standing at the window at night gazing at the sky and giving praise to God who created it. That is all. One line, a girl at a window in the dark looking up, and it stays with me because it is such a simple human thing. Not fearful, not searching for omens, though the medieval world certainly did that too. Just looking, just standing in the presence of something vastly larger than herself and allowing that presence to be felt. The stars of Charlemagne's time, 800 years before gaslighting, 1100 years before the electric bulb, 1200 years before the smartphone's blue glow would have been overwhelming in their number and their brightness. Not a handful of the brightest points we struggle to see through suburban haze, but the full sky. The Milky Way arching overhead with the clarity of spilled milk. Every constellation its own dense cloud of light. This was free. This was ordinary. This was simply what happened when you stood outside on a clear night and lifted your eyes. Astronomy was a required field of study in medieval universities. Not optional, not for specialists. Required. From London to Baghdad, students of medicine, philosophy and theology were expected to understand the movements of the celestial bodies, not because they were going to become professional astronomers, but because the night sky was considered part of the basic architecture of the world you lived in. You needed to know it the way you needed to know how to read and how to calculate and how to reason. This was not superstition, though. Superstition certainly existed alongside it. This was an attempt to live in genuine relationship with the cosmos, to understand the environment you actually inhabited, rather than the smaller and smaller bubble of human-made space we have gradually retreated into as the lights have come on. The historian Boethius, writing in the 6th century in prison, awaiting execution in what must have been the darkest and most isolated period of a mind we know to have been extraordinary, wrote about the cosmos with a tenderness that still carries across 1500 years. He described fortune as a wheel always turning nothing permanent, nothing truly secure, and in that description there is a humility that the night sky produces almost automatically. You cannot stand under a genuinely dark sky and hold simultaneously an exaggerated sense of your own importance. The math does not work. The scale corrects you gently but absolutely. His book, The Consolation of Philosophy, written in a prison cell while he waited to die, is one of the most widely copied manuscripts of the entire medieval period. It circulated in hundreds of handwritten copies across Europe for 1,000 years. The medievalist C.S. Lewis, who loved the medieval cosmos perhaps more than any 20th century scholar, wrote that to acquire a taste for Boethius is almost to become naturalized in the Middle Ages. To read Boethius is to find a mind that has made its peace with smallness, a mind that has stood under enough stars to know that the universe is larger than any individual story within it. That peace, that specific variety of equanimity that comes from genuine encounters with scale, is what the medieval night offered its inhabitants every single clear evening, without apps, without scheduling, without a trip to a designated dark sky reserve. Just the turning off of the fire and the stepping outside. Here is what I want to give you as we near the close. Not a recommendation. I am not in the business of telling people how to live, and I am deeply aware that most of us cannot simply opt out of the modern world's light and its schedules and its demands, nor would we rationally want to. But a reframe, a way of holding this history that might be useful. The things we've lost the watch between sleeps, the darkness of genuine night, the community gathered around a shared fire, the unhurried intimacy of a household with nowhere to be, and no screen to turn to were not primitive failures to achieve something better. They were specific achievements in their own right. They were solutions developed over thousands of years of human experience to the problem of being alive in the dark. And some of them, the science is beginning to tell us, were solutions to biological problems that our modern arrangements have not fully replaced. The body still needs the things it needed. Then real darkness, segmented rest time in the night, that is not simply a worse version of the day, genuine encounters with scale and silence and the sky. The medieval night was frightening. It was cold and dangerous and full of real hazards that modern people are right to be glad are mostly gone. But it was also profoundly inhabited. There were people in it awake, present, purposeful at every hour. The watchman calling the time, the midwife finding her way by lantern to the next birth, the monk singing in the dark at 2 a.m, the husband and wife talking quietly in the watch hour, in the specific intimacy that absolute darkness and absolute silence create between two people who have nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. What if? And I offer this only as a question, not an instruction. What if some of what we call disconnection, some of what we call loneliness, some of what we call the vague, unnamed restlessness of modern life is at least partly the experience of being cut off from the night, of never actually being in it, never letting it be what it is, never sitting inside it long enough to discover what it has to teach. The medieval dark had teeth, yes, but it also had depth. I want to leave you with one final image. Not historical this time, intentionally not historical, just a possibility. Imagine putting your phone down now, not forever, just for the minutes until sleep takes you. Imagine lying in whatever darkness you can actually find, turning off the last light, pulling the blind against the street's ambient glow, just making whatever small gesture toward genuine dark you can manage where you are. Imagine breathing slowly, letting the room become itself, and imagine somewhere inside that darkness, inside the body's oldest intelligence, the part that predates your name and your work and your anxieties about whether you are sleeping correctly, the faint beginning of something that medieval people would have recognized immediately, the sense that the night is large and you are small and the body knows what to do now, the first sleep beginning, the watch waiting patiently somewhere beyond it, the second sleep and then the slow return of light. This is what they had, every night, for 1,000 years and more, and some part of you, the part that wakes sometimes at midnight feeling strangely clear, the part that stares at a campfire and cannot explain why it feels like coming home, the part that looks up at actual stars and suddenly does not care as much about whatever was worrying you before that part still knows it. You still know it. The dark is yours. So, we have reached the end of tonight's journey through the medieval night. 12 stories, 12 windows, one long passage through a world that existed for 1,000 years and ended quietly, quickly, almost without anyone noticing when the first lanterns went up in Paris on a winter evening in 1667. We have walked with watchmen and priests, slept in crowded beds and prayed in cold stone churches at 2 a.m, drunk ale with alewives and traded dice with gamblers and sat vigil with the dead. We've heard the curfew bell and felt the particular quality of silence that falls after it. We've seen what fire meant to people who had nothing else, and what light costs when you measure it by the quarter hour. And if I have done this well, and you will tell me in the comments whether I have, which I genuinely hope you do, you are leaving this journey with something that you did not have at the beginning. Not just information, not just historical facts, something more like a recovered kinship with people who lived very far from you in time, but not, as it turns out, in the things that matter most. They were tired. They were afraid of the dark and brave in it. They loved the people sleeping beside them. They looked up at the stars and felt small and felt held. They were human, entirely recognizably human, and their night was your night once, not so long ago. Thank you for spending this night with me. I know that sounds like a small thing to say after everything we've walked through together, but I mean it in the fullest way. The fact that you are here in the dark, choosing to spend the hours before sleep with a story rather than with noise that is not nothing, that is in its small way a kind of medieval thing to do. If this journey gave you something, a thought that surprised you, a fact you will carry with you, a feeling you did not expect, I would genuinely love to know. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what part of this world reached through to you. Tell me which hour of the medieval night you would most want to have lived inside just for an evening. I read everything. I am in there reading. And subscribe if you have not, because there are more nights ahead. More worlds to step into in the dark. More stories that have been waiting a long time for someone to light a small candle and read them aloud. The next story is already taking shape. It involves a different kind of darkness, a different civilization, a different set of questions about what happens when the sun goes down and ordinary people are left to figure out who they are in the absence of its light. I cannot wait to take you there. For now, though, it is late. The fire is low. Whatever version of first sleep is available to you, I hope it finds you quickly and holds you warmly until the watch, and then through to the morning. Sleep well. The watchman is calling the hour somewhere in the dark. All is well.